The warm Caribbean breeze carries whispers of forgotten legends across crystal blue waters that once ran red with blood and echoed with cannon fire. While Hollywood has painted pirates as lovable rogues with hearts of gold, the truth behind these seafaring criminals reveals a far more complex and brutal reality. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let me take you on a journey through the real Caribbean, where desperate men and women carved out empires of terror and treasure beneath tropical skies. The year is 1650, and the Caribbean archipelago stretches like scattered emeralds across an endless ocean. Spanish treasure galleons heavy with Aztec gold and Incan silver navigate these treacherous waters, following ancient routes that have made kings wealthy beyond imagination. But lurking in hidden coves and secluded harbours, another breed of seafarer watches and waits. These are not the charming adventurers of Disney's imagination, but hardened criminals whose very names would send shivers down the spines of honest sailors from Port Royal to Cartagena. The transformation of these tropical waters into history's most notorious pirate haven didn't happen overnight. It began with humble hunters on a forgotten island, men who never intended to become the terror of the Spanish Main. On Hispaniola, that large island now divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, groups of European castaways and deserters had learned to survive by hunting the wild pigs that roamed the interior forests. They built special wooden huts called boucans, where they smoked their meat, earning them the name boucaniers. These rough men, weathered by sun and hardship, possessed skills that would prove invaluable in the wars to come. As tensions between European powers escalated, colonial governors began to see opportunity in these skilled hunters and their intimate knowledge of Caribbean waters. The governors of islands like Jamaica started issuing letters of marque, official documents that transformed common criminals into privateers, legally sanctioned pirates operating under the protection of their sponsoring nation. What began as a military strategy would unleash forces that even kings could not control. The Caribbean itself seemed designed by nature for piracy. Thousands of small islands dotted the region, each offering countless hidden bays and secret anchorages where ships could disappear from pursuing naval vessels. The native populations, decimated by European diseases like smallpox and measles, had left these islands largely empty, creating perfect bases for criminal enterprises. Yellow fever and malaria stalked European naval crews unfamiliar with tropical diseases, while seasoned pirates had either developed immunity or accepted death as part of their profession. Into this perfect storm of geography and geopolitics stepped men whose names would echo through history. But perhaps none would capture the imagination quite like a former English sailor whose real name was Edward Teach, though the world would remember him by a different title entirely. Blackbeard, as he came to be known, understood something fundamental about the psychology of terror that most pirates missed entirely. Standing well over 6 feet tall at a time, when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, Edward Teach possessed a natural advantage in intimidation, but it was his theatrical genius that transformed him from a common pirate into a legend that parents would use to frighten misbehaving children for generations. Before battle, Teach would weave hemp fibers soaked in saltpeter into his massive black beard, then light them so that his head appeared wreathed in demonic smoke. The image of this towering figure emerging from the gunsmoke of naval combat, his face obscured by flickering flames, and his eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence, proved so terrifying that many ships surrendered without firing a shot. The irony of Blackbeard's fearsome reputation lay in a fact that historians would discover centuries later. Despite his terrifying appearance and bloodthirsty legend, Edward Teach had never actually killed a single person in battle before his final confrontation. His success came not from brutality, but from psychological warfare so effective that violence became unnecessary. When sailors saw those distinctive black sails on the horizon and caught sight of that smoking apparition on the quarterdeck, resistance simply melted away. Teach's flagship, Queen Anne's Revenge, represented the pinnacle of pirate engineering and intimidation. Originally a French slave ship called La Concorde, Teach had captured and modified her into a floating fortress mounting 40 cannons and crewed by over 300 desperate men from across the Atlantic world. The ship's very appearance struck fear into merchant captains, her black hull decorated with carved skulls and her rigging hung with the tattered flags of defeated enemies. But Blackbeard's reign of terror could not last forever. The same governors who had once welcomed pirates as unofficial naval auxiliaries now found their creations had grown beyond control. Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood, facing increasing pressure from London to restore order to colonial shipping lanes, placed a bounty of £100 on Teach's head, dead or alive. The sum represented a fortune to common sailors, and it attracted the attention of Royal Navy Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a professional officer who understood that his career depended on eliminating the pirate threat. The final confrontation came on November 22, 1718, in the shallow waters off Ocracoke Island in North Carolina. Maynard had tracked Blackbeard to this remote anchorage, gambling that the pirate's overconfidence would lead him to underestimate the determination of his pursuers. The battle that followed would mark not just the end of Edward Teach, but the beginning of the end for the Golden Age of Caribbean piracy. As dawn broke over the inlet, 2 sloops flying Royal Navy colours approached the anchorage where Queen Anne's Revenge lay at anchor. Blackbeard, awakening to find enemy vessels within cannon range, quickly realised he faced the most serious threat of his piratical career. But the man who had terrorised the Caribbean for years was not about to surrender without a fight that would enter maritime legend. The engagement began with a thunderous exchange of cannon fire that echoed across the water like rolling thunder. Blackbeard, despite being outgunned, used his superior knowledge of local waters to manoeuvre his ship into positions where the deeper draft Navy vessels couldn't follow. For hours, the 3 ships played a deadly game of cat and mouse among the shoals and sandbars that dotted the inlet. But Lieutenant Maynard had anticipated this strategy. Rather than pursue the pirate ship into waters where his vessels might run aground, he ordered his men to wait patiently at the mouth of the inlet. Blackbeard, running low on ammunition and facing the prospect of being trapped in the anchorage, made the fateful decision to break out through the Navy blockade. What followed was perhaps the most savage hand-to-hand combat in the history of Caribbean piracy. As Queen Anne's Revenge attempted to ram past the Navy sloops, grappling hooks flew across the narrowing gap between ships. Pirates and sailors alike drew cutlasses and pistols as the vessels crashed together in a chaos of splintering wood and screaming men. Blackbeard himself led the boarding party that swarmed across the gap between ships, his massive frame cutting through Navy resistance like a scythe through grain. Witnesses later reported that the pirate captain fought with the fury of a man possessed, wielding both cutlass and pistol with deadly effect. But even the most fearsome pirate could not withstand the combined assault of a dozen determined sailors. When the smoke finally cleared, Edward Teach lay dead on the blood-soaked deck, his body bearing 25 stab wounds and 5 gunshot wounds. Lieutenant Maynard, following the grisly customs of the age, ordered the pirate's head severed and hung from his ship's bowsprit as proof of the kill. Blackbeard's headless body was thrown overboard, where local legend claimed it swam around the ship 3 times before finally sinking beneath the waves. The death of Blackbeard sent shockwaves throughout the Caribbean pirate community. If the most feared pirate captain of the age could be hunted down and killed, then no pirate was truly safe from the growing reach of royal justice. But the Golden Age of Piracy was far from over, and other legends were already being born in the hidden coves and secret harbours of the Spanish Main. Among the most remarkable of these emerging figures were two women whose very existence challenged every assumption about gender roles in the violent world of Caribbean piracy. Bonny and Mary Read would prove that courage, cunning, and ruthlessness were not exclusively masculine virtues, and their partnership would become one of the most celebrated and mysterious chapters in pirate history. Bonny's path to piracy began in the taverns and brothels of Nassau, that lawless Bahamian port that had become the unofficial capital of Caribbean piracy. Born in Ireland but raised in the American colonies, she possessed a fiery temperament that had already led to scandal and violence before she ever set foot on a pirate vessel. Her marriage to James Bonny, a small-time sailor and sometime pirate, had been tumultuous from the start, marked by jealousy, violence and mutual infidelity. When Anne met John Rackham, known throughout the Caribbean as Calico Jack for his flamboyant dress and colourful personality, the attraction was immediate and explosive. Rackham represented everything that James Bonny was not: successful, charismatic, and dangerously attractive to a woman seeking adventure beyond the confines of colonial society. Their affair scandalized even the notoriously permissive society of Nassau, where prostitutes and pirates mingled freely in taverns that never closed. But Bonny's most significant relationship would prove to be with another woman whose own journey to piracy was even more extraordinary. Mary Read had spent most of her life disguised as a man, a deception that began in childhood when her mother dressed her as a boy to claim inheritance money intended for a deceased male heir. This early experience with gender deception had taught Mary that the world offered far more opportunities to those who could successfully navigate its masculine domains. When these two remarkable women joined Calico Jack's crew in 1720, they brought skills and perspectives that would transform the very nature of pirate operations in the Caribbean. Unlike their male counterparts, who often relied on brute force and intimidation, Bonny and Read combined their combat abilities with tactical intelligence and psychological insight that made them invaluable members of any pirate crew. Their criminal partnership reached its peak during the summer and autumn of 1720, when Rackham's crew embarked on a series of raids that demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of pirate operations in an increasingly hostile environment. Operating primarily in the waters around Jamaica and the northern Caribbean, they targeted merchant vessels and coastal settlements with a precision that spoke to careful planning and intimate knowledge of local shipping patterns. But the very success that made them famous also attracted the attention of authorities who were becoming increasingly effective at hunting down pirates. The Royal Navy had expanded its Caribbean presence dramatically since Blackbeard's death, and colonial governors now possessed both the resources and the political will to eliminate piracy once and for all. The end came swiftly and dramatically on a moonless night in October 1720, when Captain Jonathan Barnett, commanding a heavily armed sloop commissioned by the governor of Jamaica, surprised Rackham's crew while they were anchored in a secluded bay. The pirates, many of them drunk on captured rum, were caught completely off guard by the sudden appearance of the government vessel. What followed was a battle that would become legendary, not for its duration or intensity, but for the stark contrast it revealed between the courage of the women pirates and the cowardice of their male companions. As Barnett's men swarmed aboard the pirate vessel, most of Rackham's crew fled below decks or cowered behind whatever cover they could find. Only Bonny and Mary Read remained on deck, fighting desperately to repel the boarders with cutlass and pistol. Contemporary accounts describe a scene of almost surreal violence with two women in men's clothing standing back to back against overwhelming odds, while their male crewmates abandoned them to face capture or death alone. Bonny, her red hair streaming behind her as she wielded her cutlass with deadly precision, shouted curses at the hidden men that would have made seasoned sailors blush. Mary Red, her disguise finally abandoned, fought with the cold efficiency of a professional soldier, her movements economical and lethal. But courage alone could not overcome superior numbers and firepower. Within minutes, both women were overwhelmed and captured, joining their male companions in the ship's hold as prisoners bound for Jamaica and almost certain execution. The Golden Age of Caribbean piracy was entering its final phase, and even the most legendary figures would soon discover that the world was changing in ways that made their way of life impossible to sustain. As our journey through these blood-soaked waters continues, we'll discover how a Welsh privateer named Henry Morgan built an empire of terror that made him both the most feared pirate in the Caribbean and eventually the lieutenant governor of Jamaica. We'll explore the democratic societies that pirates created aboard their ships, complete with written constitutions and elected leadership that wouldn't look out of place in a modern democracy. And we'll visit Port Royal, the wickedest city on earth, where pirates and prostitutes lived in luxury until divine judgment struck in the form of a catastrophic earthquake that swallowed most of the city beneath the waves. The real pirates of the Caribbean were neither the romantic heroes of Hollywood nor the one-dimensional villains of imperial propaganda. They were complex individuals navigating a brutal world where survival often depended on violence, cunning, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Their stories reveal truths about human nature, power, and the clash between civilization and wilderness that remain relevant today. So let the gentle sound of Caribbean waves carry you towards sleep. But remember that these same waters once echoed with cannon fire and the dying screams of men and women whose names have been written in blood across the pages of history. The pirates of the Caribbean were real, and their legacy continues to shape our understanding of freedom, rebellion, and the price of pursuing dreams in a world that offers no guarantees except death and the eternal rhythm of the sea. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Spanish Town, as Henry Morgan strode through streets lined with merchants hawking their wares and sailors stumbling from taverns that had never truly closed. But this was not the Henry Morgan of legend, the feared buccaneer whose very name could empty Spanish ports from Cartagena to Veracruz. This was Sir Henry Morgan, newly knighted by King Charles himself and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, a transformation so complete it defied belief. Morgan's journey from cattle hunter to colonial administrator represented the strange alchemy of Caribbean politics, where today's pirate could become tomorrow's governor if he possessed sufficient cunning and ruthlessness. Born in Wales around 1635, Morgan had arrived in the Caribbean as a young man seeking fortune in a world where traditional social hierarchies meant nothing and success belonged to those bold enough to seize it. The transformation began in the smoking ruins of Portobello, that heavily fortified Spanish port on the Panamanian coast that guarded the treasure routes connecting the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. In 1668, Morgan had led 400 buccaneers in an assault that demonstrated both his tactical genius and his complete disregard for conventional military wisdom. While Spanish commanders expected any attack to come from the sea, Morgan landed his forces miles away and approached the fortress through dense jungle that military experts considered impassable. The battle for Portobello revealed Morgan's understanding of psychological warfare that rivaled even Blackbeard's theatrical genius. Rather than simply storm the fortress walls, he forced captured Spanish civilians to carry scaling ladders and approach the ramparts ahead of his men. The Spanish defenders, faced with the choice between firing on their own people or allowing the pirates to advance, hesitated long enough for Morgan's forces to overwhelm their positions. But it was the aftermath of victory that truly established Morgan's reputation for both brilliance and brutality. Rather than simply looting the town and departing, he held the entire population hostage while demanding an enormous ransom from the Spanish colonial government. For weeks, his men occupied Portobello while negotiations proceeded, during which time they systematically tortured prominent citizens to reveal the locations of hidden treasure. The wealth seized at Portobello exceeded anything previously captured by Caribbean pirates. Spanish records, discovered centuries later in Seville archives, revealed that Morgan's raid had netted over 200,000 pieces of eight, and some that would be worth tens of millions in modern currency. More importantly, the psychological impact of the victory reverberated throughout the Spanish Caribbean, where colonial officials realized that no port, regardless of its fortifications, was truly safe from buccaneer assault. Morgan's success at Portobello established him as the undisputed leader of Caribbean buccaneers, but it also attracted the attention of more powerful forces. The English government, engaged in an increasingly complex diplomatic dance with Spain, found itself in the awkward position of simultaneously benefiting from Morgan's raids while officially condemning piracy. The solution was typically English in its elegant hypocrisy. Morgan would be granted semi-official status as a privateer, operating under letters of marque that made his attacks legally defensible while providing the Crown with plausible deniability. The arrangement reached its pinnacle in 1671 with Morgan's most audacious enterprise, the assault on Panama City, the greatest Spanish stronghold on the Pacific coast, and the terminus of the treasure route that carried Peruvian silver across the isthmus to Caribbean ports. The expedition would require crossing 60 miles of some of the most hostile terrain in the Americas, through jungles filled with poisonous snakes, disease-carrying insects, and indigenous peoples who had learned to hate all Europeans with equal fervor. Morgan assembled a fleet of 37 vessels, carrying nearly 2,000 men, the largest buccaneer force ever assembled in Caribbean waters. The multinational army included English deserters, French adventurers, Dutch merchants seeking profit, escaped African slaves, and indigenous allies who had their own reasons for wanting to see Spanish power broken. This diverse coalition represented the democratic ideals that would become central to pirate culture, where a man's worth was measured by his courage and skill rather than his birth or nationality. The crossing of the Panamanian Isthmus became an epic of endurance that tested even the hardiest buccaneers. Morgan's men abandoned their ships on the Caribbean coast and began a march through terrain that had defeated previous expeditions. Supplies ran low within days, forcing the army to subsist on whatever they could hunt or forage from the hostile environment. Disease claimed dozens of lives, while others fell victim to indigenous attacks or simply disappeared into the green hell of the jungle. But Morgan's genius lay not just in his ability to inspire men to follow him into hell, but in his understanding of how to turn adversity into advantage. As his army grew more desperate, their motivation for reaching Panama City intensified. The promise of Spanish gold became not just a dream of wealth, but a matter of survival for men who had burned their bridges and committed themselves to victory or death. When the exhausted buccaneers finally emerged from the jungle and saw the spires of Panama City gleaming in the Pacific sunlight, they faced the largest Spanish army ever assembled to oppose a pirate force. The governor of Panama had gathered over 3,000 soldiers, including regular troops sent from Spain, colonial militia, and indigenous auxiliaries. The Spanish possessed superior numbers, better equipment, and the advantage of fighting on familiar ground. The Battle of Panama demonstrated why Henry Morgan had become the most feared buccaneer in the Caribbean. Rather than launching a frontal assault against prepared Spanish positions, he divided his forces and attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. While one group of buccaneers engaged the Spanish army on the main approach to the city, other units circled around to attack from unexpected angles. The complex maneuver required precise timing and absolute trust between commanders, qualities that Spanish military doctrine insisted were impossible among undisciplined pirates. The Spanish defense collapsed within hours, not from superior buccaneer firepower, but from the psychological impact of fighting an enemy that refused to follow conventional military rules. Spanish soldiers trained to fight European armies found themselves facing opponents who emerged from the jungle like phantoms, struck with devastating effect, and melted away before organized resistance could develop. The rigid command structure that gave Spanish forces their strength in conventional warfare became a liability when facing an enemy that operated according to different principles entirely. The sack of Panama City that followed the military victory established new standards for both the wealth and the destruction that buccaneer raids could achieve. Spanish colonial records, preserved in archives from Mexico City to Madrid, document the systematic looting of the richest city on the Pacific coast. Churches were stripped of their golden altars, private homes ransacked for hidden treasure, and government buildings emptied of the silver reserves that funded Spanish colonial administration. But the destruction went beyond mere theft. Morgan's men, driven by years of accumulated hatred for Spanish colonial policies, systematically destroyed what they could not carry away. Churches were burned, government buildings demolished, and the city's infrastructure so thoroughly wrecked that Panama City had to be rebuilt several miles from its original location. The level of destruction shocked even contemporary observers, accustomed to the brutalities of colonial warfare. The psychological impact of Panama's fall reverberated throughout the Spanish Empire like an earthquake. For over a century, Spanish colonists had believed their Pacific coast settlements were protected by the impenetrable barrier of the Panamanian jungle. Morgan's successful crossing demonstrated that no Spanish possession was truly safe from buccaneer assault, a realization that forced fundamental changes in colonial defense strategy and trade route planning. But Morgan's greatest triumph also marked the beginning of his transformation from pirate to politician. The wealth captured at Panama was so enormous that it attracted the attention of European governments, whose previous tolerance for Caribbean piracy evaporated when faced with the implications of successful large-scale raids. The Treaty of Madrid, signed between England and Spain in 1670, officially ended the policy of using privateers against Spanish colonial possessions. King Charles, caught between diplomatic necessity and reluctance to abandon a successful policy, chose a characteristically devious solution. Morgan would be arrested and brought to London for trial, satisfying Spanish demands for justice. But the trial would be a carefully orchestrated performance designed to enhance rather than destroy Morgan's reputation, setting the stage for his eventual return to Jamaica in an official capacity. The London trial of Henry Morgan became one of the great theatrical events of the Restoration period. Morgan, dressed in the finest clothes that Spanish gold could buy, appeared before judges who were secretly sympathetic to his achievements. Witnesses testified to his military genius, his loyalty to the English crown, and his role in expanding English influence in the Caribbean. The prosecution, hampered by government instructions to avoid seriously damaging Morgan's reputation, could do little more than go through the motions of seeking justice. The verdict was inevitable. Morgan was found guilty of unauthorized military action, but recommended for royal mercy based on his services to English interests. King Charles, following a script written months earlier, not only pardoned the buccaneer, but knighted him and appointed him Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. The pirate, who had terrorized Spanish America, became Sir Henry Morgan, representative of royal authority in the Caribbean. Morgan's appointment as lieutenant governor represented more than personal advancement. It symbolized the English government's recognition that Caribbean piracy had evolved beyond simple criminality into a form of irregular warfare that could advance national interests more effectively than conventional military action. The buccaneers, who had once operated outside legal authority, now found themselves transformed into instruments of imperial policy. The new lieutenant governor faced the complex challenge of governing the same pirates he had once led while maintaining the delicate balance between English colonial interests and international diplomatic requirements. His solution demonstrated the political sophistication that had made him successful as both pirate and privateer. He would suppress unauthorized piracy while channeling buccaneer energies toward officially sanctioned activities that served English colonial expansion. Under Morgan's administration, Jamaica became the center of a new form of Caribbean governance that blended traditional colonial authority with the democratic practices that had evolved aboard pirate ships. Former buccaneers found themselves appointed to official positions. Their intimate knowledge of Caribbean waters and Spanish colonial weaknesses making them invaluable administrators. The island's economy, built on a foundation of pirate gold and slave labor, flourished as never before. But Morgan's greatest achievement as colonial administrator was his success in transforming Port Royal from a pirate haven into the commercial center of the English Caribbean. The city that had once been notorious for its lawlessness became a legitimate trading port where merchants from across the Atlantic world conducted business under the protection of English law. The transformation required delicate negotiations with former pirates, who possessed both the wealth and the connections necessary for legitimate commercial success. The metamorphosis of Port Royal reflected broader changes occurring throughout the Caribbean as the Golden Age of Piracy gradually gave way to more systematic forms of colonial exploitation. The same men who had once terrorized Spanish shipping now invested their accumulated wealth in sugar plantations, slave trading operations, and legitimate merchant enterprises. Piracy had not disappeared, but it was being absorbed into the larger framework of English colonial expansion. Morgan's success in managing this transition established him as one of the most effective colonial administrators in English America, but it also created new challenges that would ultimately prove insurmountable. The very success of his policies attracted increasing numbers of former pirates to Jamaica, creating a population whose loyalty to legal authority remained questionable. More ominously, the wealth that flowed through Port Royal attracted the attention of a new generation of pirates who possessed neither Morgan's political sophistication nor his loyalty to English interests. As the 1680s progressed, reports reached Spanish Town of increasing pirate activity in Caribbean waters. Unlike the organized buccaneer expeditions of Morgan's era, these new pirates operated as independent criminals whose only loyalty was to immediate profit. They attacked English shipping as readily as Spanish, recognizing no national boundaries and acknowledging no authority beyond their own immediate interests. The challenge facing Morgan as lieutenant governor was how to suppress this new form of piracy without destroying the networks of former buccaneers, whose support was essential to English colonial security. The solution required a careful balance between enforcement and accommodation that tested even Morgan's considerable political skills. Former pirates who accepted legitimate roles in colonial society would be protected and encouraged, while those who continued criminal activities would face the full force of English law. The policy's implementation revealed the fundamental contradictions inherent in trying to transform a pirate society into a legitimate colonial community. Many former buccaneers found the transition to legal commerce impossibly restrictive, while others discovered that their accumulated wealth provided opportunities for social advancement that had been unimaginable during their criminal careers. The result was a colonial society unlike any other in the English Caribbean, where former pirates served as magistrates and church wardens while their former victims became business partners. But the most significant challenge to Morgan's administration came not from within Jamaica, but from the changing international situation that made his balancing act increasingly difficult to maintain. The rise of French power in the Caribbean, combined with renewed Spanish military efficiency, created pressures that tested the limits of English colonial resources. The informal networks of former pirates that had once provided Jamaica's primary defense were no longer adequate to meet the challenges of conventional warfare between European powers. The transformation of Henry Morgan from pirate to politician represented the broader evolution of Caribbean society as the 17th century drew to a close. The age of individual adventurers seeking personal fortune through acts of piracy was giving way to a more systematic form of colonial exploitation based on plantation agriculture and slave labor. The very success of men like Morgan in accumulating wealth through piracy had created the capital necessary for investment in legitimate enterprises that promised more reliable, if less spectacular, returns. As Morgan aged and his health declined, he could look back on a career that had encompassed the entire spectrum of Caribbean colonial experience. He had begun as a common soldier seeking his fortune in a hostile environment, risen to become the most feared pirate in the Spanish Main, and concluded his career as a respected colonial administrator whose policies had helped transform Jamaica into one of England's most valuable Caribbean possessions. But the world that had made Morgan's extraordinary career possible was rapidly disappearing. The informal networks of buccaneers and privateers that had dominated Caribbean warfare for half a century were being replaced by professional navies and regular armies that operated according to European military conventions. The democratic traditions that had flourished aboard pirate ships were giving way to more hierarchical forms of colonial governance based on plantation society and slave labor. The legacy of Henry Morgan and his generation of buccaneers would endure in the institutions they had helped create and the precedents they had established for English colonial expansion. But the Golden Age of Caribbean piracy was entering its final phase, and new forms of maritime criminality were emerging that would test the limits of colonial authority in ways that even Morgan could not have anticipated. As we continue our journey through these troubled waters, we'll discover how the democratic traditions that flourished aboard pirate ships created some of the most progressive societies of their age, complete with written constitutions that guaranteed rights unheard of in contemporary European kingdoms. We'll explore the rise and fall of Nassau, the pirate republic that challenged the authority of European empires and offered a glimpse of what Caribbean society might have become under different circumstances. But the most remarkable aspect of pirate society was not their capacity for violence, but their development of democratic institutions that would not look out of place in a modern republic. Aboard pirate vessels throughout the Caribbean, crews operated according to written constitutions called Articles of Agreement that guaranteed rights and freedoms unknown in the monarchical societies from which most pirates had fled. These pirate codes, far from being crude sets of rules governing criminal behavior, represented sophisticated attempts to create just societies based on principles of equality and shared governance. The articles drafted by Bartholomew Roberts, perhaps the most successful pirate captain of the Golden Age, established democratic procedures that European philosophers could only dream about. Every crew member possessed an equal vote in matters of importance, from selecting targets for attack to choosing new captains when leadership positions became vacant. The economic arrangements aboard pirate ships challenged every assumption about property and wealth distribution that dominated European society. Unlike merchant vessels where common sailors received fixed wages regardless of the voyage's success, pirate crews shared captured wealth according to predetermined formulas that recognized each member's contribution to the enterprise. Captains and officers received larger shares, but the difference was modest compared to the vast inequalities that characterized legitimate maritime commerce. Roberts's code included provisions that seem remarkably progressive, even by contemporary standards. Wounded pirates received compensation from the Common Fund, creating perhaps the world's first systematic disability insurance program. The code prohibited gambling with dice or cards for money, recognizing that such activities could destroy the social cohesion essential for successful pirate operations. Most remarkably, the articles guaranteed that decisions affecting the entire crew would be made by democratic vote rather than autocratic command. The implementation of these democratic principles created societies aboard pirate ships that offered freedoms unavailable anywhere else in the 18th century world. Former slaves who joined pirate crews found themselves treated as equals, participating in democratic decision-making processes and sharing in captured wealth according to the same formulas that applied to white crew members. This racial equality, while motivated by practical necessity rather than moral conviction, created integrated communities that would not be seen again until the civil rights movements of the 20th century. Women, though rare aboard pirate vessels, could also find opportunities for advancement that were impossible in conventional society. Beyond the famous examples of Anne Bonny and Mary Red, scattered records suggest that other women served aboard pirate ships in various capacities, from skilled sailors to medical practitioners. The democratic traditions of pirate society, combined with the practical need for competent crew members, created environments where gender restrictions that dominated land-based societies could be temporarily suspended. The religious tolerance practiced aboard many pirate ships reflected their international composition and democratic ideals. Crews that included English Protestants, Irish Catholics, French Huguenots, Spanish converts, and practitioners of African spiritual traditions could not afford the luxury of religious persecution. The practical necessities of shipboard life forced pirates to develop forms of religious accommodation that would not appear in mainstream European society for generations. But perhaps the most significant democratic innovation of pirate society was the practice of electing captains and deposing them when they failed to meet crew expectations. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of naval and merchant vessels, pirate captains served at the pleasure of their crews and could be removed by majority vote. This system created a form of accountable leadership that European political theorists were only beginning to imagine. The election of Bartholomew Roberts himself illustrated how these democratic processes functioned in practice. When Captain Howell Davis was killed in an ambush on the West African coast in 1719, his crew faced the challenge of selecting new leadership from among men who had served together for only a few months. Rather than allowing the strongest or most ruthless member to seize control, they held a formal election that considered each candidate's qualifications and experience. Roberts, despite being a relative newcomer to piracy, won election based on his demonstrated competence and his reputation for fair dealing with crew members. His acceptance speech, recorded by contemporary observers, revealed the sophisticated understanding of democratic leadership that characterized the best pirate captains. He promised to consult the crew on all major decisions, to distribute captured wealth according to established principles, and to submit to removal if he failed to serve their collective interests effectively. The Roberts captaincy demonstrated how democratic pirate governance could function even under the extreme pressures of constant warfare and pursuit by naval forces. His crew participated in strategic planning, voted on targets for attack, and collectively decided questions of discipline and punishment. When disagreements arose, they were resolved through formal debate and majority vote rather than autocratic decree or violent confrontation. The success of Roberts's democratic leadership style contributed to his extraordinary record of capturing over 400 vessels during his 3-year career as a pirate captain. His crews fought with exceptional determination because they understood that victory would bring shared rewards, while defeat meant collective destruction. The democratic bonds that united Roberts' followers created military effectiveness that surpassed anything achieved by conventional naval forces operating under traditional hierarchical command structures. But the democratic traditions of pirate society extended beyond individual ships to encompass entire communities of maritime criminals. Nassau, the Bahamian port that served as the unofficial capital of Caribbean piracy during the early 18th century, operated according to principles of collective self-governance that challenged the authority of European colonial empires. Located on New Providence Island in the Bahamas, Nassau possessed natural advantages that made it nearly ideal as a pirate base. The harbour could accommodate large numbers of vessels while remaining hidden from casual observation by passing ships. Shallow waters surrounding the island prevented heavily armed naval vessels from approaching closely, while numerous channels and inlets provided escape routes when government forces did appear. More importantly, Nassau's isolation from effective colonial authority created a power vacuum that pirates filled with their own forms of governance. Beginning around 1706, when a Franco-Spanish assault devastated the legitimate colonial government, Nassau became a self-governing republic where pirates created institutions based on the democratic traditions they had developed aboard their ships. The governance structure that emerged in Nassau represented a fascinating experiment in direct democracy that operated without formal constitution or legal framework. Major decisions affecting the community were made in public assemblies, where any pirate in good standing could participate. These gatherings, held in taverns and on the beach, addressed questions ranging from the allocation of harbour space to the organisation of collective defence against government attempts to reassert control. The economic system that developed in Nassau reflected the egalitarian principles that governed pirate ships. Rather than allowing successful captains to accumulate vast personal wealth while their followers remained poor, the community maintained institutions that redistributed resources and provided support for pirates between voyages. Tavern keepers, merchants, and craftsmen who served the pirate community were expected to offer fair prices and honest dealing, with violations subject to collective punishment. The social life of Nassau created a unique Caribbean community where traditional hierarchies based on birth, race, and nationality were temporarily suspended in favor of more meritocratic arrangements. Former slaves who had joined pirate crews found themselves welcomed as equals in Nassau's taverns and brothels. European deserters from various national backgrounds mingled freely with colonial-born pirates and indigenous peoples who had allied themselves with the maritime criminals. Women played more prominent roles in Nassau society than would have been possible in conventional colonial communities. Beyond the famous female pirates, numerous women operated businesses, managed households, and participated in the social networks that held the community together. The absence of traditional legal authority meant that women could accumulate property and exercise influence in ways that colonial law typically prevented. The religious life of Nassau reflected the tolerance and accommodation that characterized pirate society generally. The community included practitioners of various Christian denominations, African spiritual traditions, and syncretic belief systems that had emerged from the mixing of different cultural influences. Without established religious authority, Nassau's inhabitants developed forms of spiritual practice that emphasized personal faith rather than institutional doctrine. But Nassau's most remarkable achievement was its success in maintaining independence from European colonial authority for over a decade. Despite repeated attempts by British, Spanish, and French forces to establish control over the community, The pirates successfully resisted outside interference through a combination of military preparedness, diplomatic skill, and exploitation of conflicts between European powers. The defense of Nassau relied on the same democratic principles that governed pirate ships. When government forces threatened the community, captains and crews voted on collective response strategies rather than following orders from self-appointed leaders. This democratic approach to military planning created flexible and innovative defensive tactics that confounded conventional military commanders trained in European warfare traditions. The diplomatic activities of Nassau's pirates demonstrated sophisticated understanding of international politics that belied stereotypes about pirate ignorance and barbarism. Pirate leaders maintained correspondence with colonial governors, European merchants, and even royal officials, presenting their community as a legitimate alternative to conventional colonial governance rather than mere criminal enterprise. These diplomatic efforts succeeded in part because Nassau's pirates provided services that conventional colonial authorities could not match. Their intimate knowledge of Caribbean waters made them valuable allies for merchants seeking to avoid official trade restrictions. Their military capabilities could be hired by colonial governments facing external threats. Most importantly, their willingness to attack the shipping of any nation created a form of maritime balance of power that smaller colonial settlements found useful. The commercial activities centered in Nassau created a parallel economy that operated outside the control of European mercantile systems. Pirates sold captured goods at prices below those charged by licensed merchants, creating consumer benefits that extended throughout the Caribbean colonial population. The wealth that flowed through Nassau supported not only the pirates themselves, but also the legitimate businesses that served their needs. But Nassau's success as a pirate republic also contained the seeds of its own destruction. The very prosperity that made the community attractive to maritime criminals also drew the attention of European powers, whose tolerance for pirate independence was rapidly diminishing. The growth of plantation agriculture throughout the Caribbean created demands for labor stability and commercial security that pirate activities increasingly threatened. The transformation of Caribbean colonial society from a frontier environment where piracy could flourish to a more settled plantation system based on slave labor fundamentally altered the political calculations surrounding pirate communities like Nassau. Colonial governors who had once found pirates useful allies against foreign enemies now viewed them primarily as threats to domestic security and economic development. The appointment of Woodes Rogers as Royal Governor of the Bahamas in 1718 marked the beginning of the end for Nassau as an independent pirate republic. Rogers arrived with both military force sufficient to crush pirate resistance and royal pardons generous enough to encourage voluntary surrender. His strategy of combining coercion with accommodation proved more effective than previous attempts to suppress pirate communities through force alone. The pardons offered by Rogers created deep divisions within Nassau's pirate community, between those willing to accept legitimate alternatives and those determined to continue criminal activities. The democratic traditions that had united pirates in opposition to external authority now worked against community solidarity as crews voted on whether to accept government terms or continue resistance. The debates that took place in Nassau's taverns and assembly areas during 1718 revealed the fundamental tensions inherent in trying to maintain democratic pirate communities within an increasingly hostile international environment. Older pirates who had accumulated sufficient wealth to retire comfortably supported accepting pardons and transitioning to legitimate occupations. Younger pirates with fewer resources and less experience of conventional society favoured continued resistance. The ultimate dissolution of Nassau as a pirate republic occurred not through military conquest, but through the gradual departure of pirates who chose individual survival over collective resistance. As Rogers's forces established effective control over the harbour and surrounding waters, the practical advantages that had made Nassau attractive to pirates disappeared. The community that had once challenged European colonial authority simply melted away as its members scattered to seek opportunities elsewhere. But the legacy of Nassau's experiment in democratic governance would influence Caribbean society long after the last pirates had departed. The traditions of racial equality, religious tolerance, and collective decision-making that had flourished in the pirate republic provided models for later movements seeking alternatives to European colonial authority. The democratic ideals that pirates had developed aboard their ships and implemented in their communities would reappear in various forms throughout the subsequent history of Caribbean independence movements. As the Golden Age of Piracy drew to a close, the democratic traditions that had made pirate society unique began to influence broader Caribbean colonial development. Former pirates who accepted pardons and transitioned to legitimate occupations carried with them experiences of democratic participation that gradually affected conventional colonial institutions. The plantation societies that replaced pirate communities inherited populations whose understanding of individual rights and collective governance had been shaped by their criminal experiences. The story of Nassau and similar pirate communities throughout the Caribbean revealed possibilities for social organization that challenged fundamental assumptions about authority, property, and citizenship that dominated European colonial thinking. These experiments in democratic governance, however brief and imperfect, demonstrated that alternatives to monarchical and aristocratic authority were not only possible but could function effectively under appropriate circumstances. The morning mist rising from Port Royal's harbour carried with it the scent of rum, rotting fish, and human desperation that had become the signature perfume of what contemporary observers called the wickedest city on earth. By 1660, this Jamaican port had transformed itself into something unprecedented in the colonial world, a city where pirates and prostitutes ruled the streets, where Spanish gold flowed like water through taverns that never closed, and where the normal rules of civilized society had been suspended in favor of a more primitive but honest form of human interaction. Port Royal's transformation from a modest fishing village into the Caribbean's most notorious den of iniquity had occurred with breathtaking speed. The English conquest of Jamaica in 1655 had created a strategic problem that conventional military thinking could not solve: how to defend a large island with limited resources against Spanish attempts at reconquest. The solution, proposed by Governor Edward D'Oyly, was as brilliant as it was morally questionable. Invite the pirates to make Port Royal their home. The invitation extended to the Brethren of the Coast represented a calculated gamble that would reshape Caribbean colonial society in ways that no one could have anticipated. These pirates, many of them former cattle hunters from Hispaniola who had been driven from their homes by Spanish military action, possessed intimate knowledge of Caribbean waters and an implacable hatred of Spanish authority that made them ideal allies for English colonial interests. The arrival of the Brethren transformed Port Royal almost overnight from a sleepy colonial outpost into a boom town that attracted adventurers, criminals, and fortune seekers from across the Atlantic world. Spanish gold captured in pirate raids flowed through the city's streets like a golden river, funding construction projects that created one of the most impressive urban environments in the colonial Caribbean. By the 1670s, Port Royal boasted amenities that rivaled those of London or Amsterdam. The city's merchants, grown wealthy from trading in pirate plunder, constructed elaborate houses that showcased their prosperity to visitors from across the colonial world. Churches competed with taverns for architectural prominence, creating a skyline that reflected the complex moral tensions inherent in a society built on organized crime. The social structure that emerged in Port Royal challenged every assumption about colonial hierarchy and racial relations that dominated European thinking about Caribbean society. Former slaves who had joined pirate crews found themselves welcomed in taverns where Spanish grandees would have been refused service. European deserters from various national backgrounds conducted business with indigenous allies and African merchants in an atmosphere of rough equality that scandalized visiting colonial officials. Women enjoyed freedoms in Port Royal that were unimaginable in conventional colonial society. The absence of traditional legal authority, combined with the practical needs of a community serving transient populations of sailors and pirates, created opportunities for female entrepreneurs who operated businesses ranging from legitimate boarding houses to more questionable establishments catering to maritime visitors. The economic system that developed in Port Royal represented a form of free market capitalism that operated without the regulations and restrictions that characterized European mercantile systems. Pirates sold captured goods at whatever prices the market would bear, creating consumer benefits that extended throughout the Jamaican colonial population. Merchants competed freely for customers without guild restrictions or government interference, resulting in commercial innovation that impressed even critics of the city's moral climate. Religious life in Port Royal reflected the tolerance and accommodation that characterized pirate society generally. The city supported churches representing various Christian denominations while also tolerating practitioners of African spiritual traditions and syncretic belief systems that had emerged from cultural mixing. Without established religious authority to enforce orthodoxy, Port Royal's inhabitants developed forms of spiritual practice that emphasize personal faith rather than institutional doctrine. The tavern culture that dominated Port Royal's social life created unique forms of democratic participation that extended far beyond the pirate ships where such traditions had originated. Decisions affecting the broader community were often debated in public houses where any resident could participate regardless of their social status or national origin. These informal assemblies addressed questions ranging from harbour regulations to collective defence against external threats. The most remarkable aspect of Port Royal's tavern culture was its capacity to transform potential conflicts between different ethnic and national groups into collaborative relationships based on shared economic interests. Spanish deserters drank alongside English pirates who had recently attacked their former compatriots' shipping. French buccaneers shared tables with Dutch merchants whose governments were officially at war with France. The common pursuit of profit created bonds that transcended traditional political loyalties. But perhaps the most extraordinary feature of Port Royal society was its development of informal insurance systems that provided security for residents whose livelihoods depended on inherently dangerous maritime activities. Pirate crews contributed to common funds that supported disabled members and the families of those killed in action. Merchants pooled resources to compensate colleagues whose warehouses were destroyed by fire or hurricane. These mutual aid societies represented sophisticated attempts to manage risk in an environment where conventional insurance was unavailable. The medical facilities that developed in Port Royal demonstrated the city's capacity for innovation in addressing the practical challenges of frontier life. Physicians who served pirate crews had developed expertise in treating gunshot wounds, tropical diseases, and the various injuries that resulted from maritime violence. Their knowledge, combined with medical traditions brought by practitioners from Africa and indigenous communities, created healing systems that were more effective than anything available in conventional colonial settlements. The educational opportunities available in Port Royal, while informal, provided learning experiences that were impossible to obtain elsewhere in the colonial world. Young men could acquire maritime skills aboard pirate vessels that would qualify them for positions of responsibility on legitimate merchant ships. Aspiring merchants could learn international trade practices by observing the complex negotiations involved in disposing of captured goods. Women could develop business skills by managing establishments that served the city's transient population. The artistic and cultural life of Port Royal reflected the cosmopolitan character of a community that drew residents from across the known world. Musicians from various national traditions performed in taverns where their diverse styles merged into new forms of expression. Craftsmen working with materials captured from Spanish ships created decorative objects that combined European techniques with tropical motifs. Storytellers preserved and transmitted oral traditions that would eventually influence Caribbean literature and folklore. But the very success that made Port Royal attractive to pirates and merchants also created problems that would eventually prove insurmountable. The city's reputation for lawlessness attracted increasing numbers of criminals whose activities threatened the delicate balance between profitable piracy and acceptable social order. More ominously, the wealth that flowed through Port Royal attracted the attention of European powers whose tolerance for pirate independence was rapidly diminishing. The appointment of Henry Morgan as lieutenant governor represented an attempt to transform Port Royal from a pirate haven into a legitimate colonial centre while preserving the economic benefits that criminal activities had created. Morgan's challenge was to suppress unauthorised piracy without destroying the networks of former pirates whose support was essential to Jamaican colonial security. Morgan's policies achieved considerable success in channeling pirate energies toward officially sanctioned activities that served English colonial interests. Former buccaneers found employment in the colonial militia, the customs service, and various administrative positions that utilized their specialized knowledge of Caribbean affairs. The transition was not always smooth, but it demonstrated that pirates could be integrated into legitimate colonial society under appropriate circumstances. The transformation of Port Royal under Morgan's administration created a unique colonial community where former pirates served as magistrates, church wardens, and militia officers, while maintaining the democratic traditions they had developed during their criminal careers. This hybrid society combined the efficiency of pirate organization with the stability of conventional colonial administration in ways that impressed visiting officials from other Caribbean settlements. But the demographic changes that accompanied Port Royal's transition from pirate haven to legitimate colonial centre also altered the social dynamics that had made the city unique. The arrival of conventional colonial families, complete with traditional expectations about social hierarchy and racial relations, created tensions with the egalitarian traditions that had characterized pirate society. The economic transformation proved equally complex. As pirate raids became less frequent and eventually ceased entirely, Port Royal's merchants were forced to develop alternative sources of income that could replace the steady flow of Spanish gold that had funded the city's prosperity. The transition to legitimate commerce required new relationships with suppliers and customers who operated according to conventional business practices rather than the flexible arrangements that had characterized the pirate economy. The religious changes that accompanied Port Royal's transformation reflected broader shifts in Caribbean colonial society as plantation agriculture replaced piracy as the primary economic activity. The tolerant religious atmosphere that had characterized the pirate era gave way to more conventional arrangements where established churches received official support while alternative spiritual practices faced increasing discrimination. The architectural evolution of Port Royal during this transition period revealed the tensions inherent in trying to maintain pirate traditions within an increasingly conventional colonial framework. New construction reflected European architectural styles that emphasized respectability and social hierarchy, while older buildings preserved the more egalitarian design principles that had characterized the pirate era. The educational and cultural changes that occurred during Port Royal's transformation demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of social engineering in colonial contexts. Former pirates who had developed sophisticated skills in navigation, combat, and international trade found that their knowledge was valued in legitimate occupations, but they also discovered that conventional society imposed restrictions on their behavior that had been absent during their criminal careers. The legal system that emerged in Port Royal as pirate traditions gave way to conventional colonial law illustrated the complex process of institutional change in frontier societies. Former pirates who had lived according to democratic codes found themselves subject to hierarchical legal structures that reflected European rather than Caribbean values. The transition required careful negotiation between competing concepts of justice and authority. The role of women in Port Royal society changed dramatically as conventional colonial families arrived and traditional gender roles were reimposed. Women who had enjoyed considerable freedom during the pirate era found their opportunities restricted as the city adopted more conventional social arrangements. Some adapted successfully to new circumstances, while others left Port Royal in search of communities that offered greater personal freedom. The racial dynamics of Port Royal's transformation reflected broader changes occurring throughout the Caribbean as plantation agriculture created demands for large-scale slave labor. The rough equality that had characterized relationships between different ethnic groups during the pirate era gave way to more rigid hierarchies based on European colonial models. Former slaves who had found acceptance in pirate society discovered that legitimate colonial society offered far fewer opportunities for advancement. But the most significant change that occurred during Port Royal's transformation was the gradual erosion of the democratic traditions that had made pirate society unique. The participatory decision-making processes that had characterized tavern assemblies were replaced by more conventional forms of colonial administration, where authority flowed from appointed officials rather than popular consensus. Yet even as Port Royal adapted to conventional colonial expectations, the memory of its pirate heritage continued to influence the city's character in subtle but important ways. The cosmopolitan atmosphere that had attracted residents from across the known world persisted even after official policies favored more homogeneous colonial communities. The entrepreneurial spirit that had driven pirate economic activities found new expression in legitimate commercial ventures that made Port Royal one of the most dynamic trading centers in the Caribbean. The maritime traditions that had made Port Royal important during the pirate era continued to shape the city's development as legitimate shipping replaced criminal activities. The harbour facilities that had once sheltered pirate vessels were expanded and improved to accommodate merchant ships carrying sugar, rum, and other plantation products to European markets. The shipbuilding industry that had served pirate needs adapted to construct vessels for legitimate Caribbean trade. As the 17th century drew to a close, Port Royal had successfully transformed itself from the wickedest city on earth into a respectable colonial centre that retained enough of its adventurous character to attract visitors and merchants from across the Atlantic world. The transformation demonstrated that criminal communities could evolve into legitimate societies under appropriate leadership and circumstances. But the forces that had enabled Port Royal's transformation were also creating conditions that would ultimately threaten the city's existence. The wealth that flowed through the city as a result of its strategic location and commercial importance attracted not only legitimate merchants, but also the attention of divine powers that some believed had been offended by the city's sinful past. The earthquake that would devastate Port Royal on June 7, 1692, was interpreted by many contemporary observers as divine judgment against a community that had built its prosperity on organized crime. Whether viewed as natural disaster or supernatural intervention, the earthquake would mark the end of Port Royal's golden age and the beginning of a new chapter in Caribbean colonial history. The morning of June 7, 1692, dawned clear and calm over Port Royal, with no indication that this day would become one of the most catastrophic in Caribbean colonial history. Merchants opened their shops as usual, preparing for another day of profitable trading in the goods that flowed through the city's busy harbour. Tavern keepers, who had served customers throughout the night, prepared for the midday rush that brought sailors and traders seeking refreshment and entertainment. At 20 minutes before noon, as church bells throughout the city prepared to mark the approaching hour, the earth beneath Port Royal began to tremble with a violence that defied human comprehension. The first shock lasted only moments, but it was followed by a second tremor so powerful that buildings throughout the city began to collapse into the streets. Before terrified residents could comprehend what was happening, a third shock struck with such force that entire sections of the city slid into the harbour, carrying with them the accumulated wealth and memories of 3 decades of pirate prosperity. The geological violence that destroyed Port Royal in a matter of minutes represented more than natural disaster. It symbolised the end of an era in Caribbean history when individual adventurers could carve out empires through courage, cunning, and complete disregard for conventional authority. The city that had defied European colonial expectations for over 30 years disappeared beneath the waves, as if the sea itself was reclaiming territory that had been stolen from its rightful dominion. Contemporary accounts of the disaster, written by survivors who escaped the destruction, describe scenes of almost biblical devastation that seem to confirm the worst predictions of religious authorities who had long condemned Port Royal's sinful reputation. Entire streets vanished beneath the waves, carrying with them the taverns, brothels, and counting houses where pirates had converted their stolen Spanish gold into legitimate colonial prosperity. The human cost of the earthquake was staggering, even by the violent standards of Caribbean colonial society. An estimated 2,000 people died in the initial collapse, while thousands more perished in the days that followed from injuries, disease, and exposure. The survivors, many of them stripped of everything they owned, faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives in a world where the foundations of their prosperity had literally disappeared beneath their feet. But perhaps the most significant casualty of the Port Royal earthquake was the unique social experiment that had made the city famous throughout the colonial world. The democratic traditions, racial equality, and religious tolerance that had characterized pirate society could not be reconstructed from the ruins of collapsed buildings. The disaster marked not just the end of a city, but the conclusion of the most remarkable attempt at creating an alternative form of colonial society in the history of European expansion. As news of Port Royal's destruction spread throughout the Caribbean and across the Atlantic to European capitals, it was interpreted as divine confirmation that the age of piracy was drawing to a close. Religious authorities proclaimed the earthquake as evidence of God's displeasure with societies that tolerated criminal behavior, while political leaders pointed to the disaster as proof that unconventional colonial arrangements were ultimately unsustainable. The survivors who remained in Jamaica after the earthquake faced the task of creating new lives within the more conventional colonial framework that was rapidly replacing the freewheeling pirate society of earlier decades. Some adapted successfully to changed circumstances, using skills acquired during the pirate era to establish legitimate businesses within the emerging plantation economy. Others found the transition impossible and departed for frontier regions where the old ways might still find acceptance. The reconstruction efforts that followed Port Royal's destruction revealed the profound changes that had already begun transforming Caribbean society before the earthquake struck. The new Port Royal that slowly emerged from the rubble was a far more conventional colonial settlement, one that reflected the growing dominance of plantation agriculture over the maritime adventurism that had once defined the region's character. The taverns that were rebuilt catered to respectable merchants rather than pirates, and the harbour that had once sheltered criminal fleets now accommodated vessels carrying sugar and slaves according to the rigid schedules of legitimate commerce. Yet even as Port Royal's unique social experiment came to an end, the traditions that had flourished there continued to influence Caribbean society in ways that would shape the region's future long after the last pirates had disappeared from its waters. The democratic ideals that had governed pirate ships found new expression in the resistance movements that would eventually challenge European colonial authority throughout the islands. The racial equality that had characterized pirate crews provided inspiration for later struggles against the plantation system's brutal hierarchies. The story of Bartholomew Roberts, perhaps the most successful pirate captain of the Golden Age, illustrates both the heights that individual adventurers could reach and the inevitable forces that would bring their era to a close. Born John Roberts in Wales around 1682, he had begun his career as a respectable merchant sailor with no apparent inclination toward criminality. His transformation into Blackbeard, the most feared pirate captain in Caribbean waters, occurred almost by accident when the slave ship Princess was captured by pirates near the West African coast in 1719. The circumstances of Roberts' recruitment into piracy revealed the complex social dynamics that drove men to abandon legitimate society for the uncertain rewards of maritime crime. As second mate aboard the Princess, Roberts possessed skills and experience that made him valuable to Captain Howell Davis, the Welsh pirate who commanded the attacking force. But rather than simply pressing Roberts into service as an unwilling crew member, Davis offered him partnership in an enterprise that promised both greater rewards and more democratic participation than conventional merchant service could provide. The choice that Roberts faced was one that confronted thousands of sailors throughout the Caribbean during the Golden Age of Piracy. Legitimate maritime employment offered security and respectability, but it also meant accepting subordinate positions within rigid hierarchies where advancement depended more on social connections than personal merit. Piracy promised immediate equality and democratic participation in decisions that affected every crew member's welfare, but it also meant accepting the constant threat of violent death and eventual punishment by legal authorities. Roberts's decision to join Davis's crew reflected the appeal that pirate society held for skilled sailors who possessed the competence to succeed in criminal enterprises, but lacked the social advantages necessary for advancement in legitimate maritime careers. His rapid rise within the pirate hierarchy demonstrated both his natural leadership abilities and the meritocratic principles that governed criminal crews, where effectiveness mattered more than birth or nationality. The death of Captain Davis in an ambush, just months after Roberts joined the crew, created an opportunity that would transform the former merchant sailor into one of history's most successful pirate captains. The election that followed Davis's death revealed the sophisticated democratic processes that had evolved within pirate society to handle succession crises that might have destroyed conventional military units. Roberts' victory in the leadership election was neither predetermined nor based solely on his maritime experience. The crew's decision reflected careful consideration of each candidate's character, leadership potential, and commitment to the democratic principles that held pirate society together. His acceptance speech, preserved in contemporary accounts, demonstrated understanding of democratic leadership that would have impressed political theorists in European capitals. The new captain's first act revealed both his strategic intelligence and his commitment to the codes of honor that governed pirate behavior. Rather than immediately seeking profitable targets for attack, Roberts ordered his crew to return to the scene of Davis's death, to exact vengeance on those responsible for killing their former leader. The mission was dangerous and offered no material rewards, but it demonstrated Roberts' understanding that successful pirate leadership required maintaining crew morale and upholding the bonds of loyalty that held criminal enterprises together. The success of this revenge expedition established Roberts' reputation for both military competence and personal honor that would attract followers throughout his subsequent career. Pirates from across the Caribbean sought to join his crew, recognizing that service under Roberts offered better prospects for both survival and prosperity than could be found with less capable captains. The democratic traditions that governed his ships created working environments where skilled sailors could advance based on merit rather than favoritism. Roberts's approach to piracy differed significantly from the theatrical methods employed by contemporaries like Blackbeard. Where other captains relied on intimidation and psychological warfare, Roberts emphasized military efficiency and strategic planning that made his attacks devastatingly effective. His crews operated with discipline that rivaled professional naval forces, but they maintained the democratic participation and shared rewards that distinguished pirate society from conventional maritime hierarchies. The fleet that Roberts assembled during his 3-year career represented the pinnacle of pirate organization and effectiveness. His flagship, Royal Fortune, mounted superior firepower and carried crews whose loyalty was based on proven success rather than mere charismatic leadership. The smaller vessels that accompanied the flagship operated according to coordinated battle plans that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of naval tactics. But Roberts' greatest innovation was his development of systematic methods for identifying and attacking the most profitable targets while avoiding unnecessary confrontations with well-armed opponents. His crews gathered intelligence about shipping movements, cargo values, and defensive capabilities that enabled them to strike with precision against vessels carrying maximum wealth while minimizing their own casualties. The raid that established Roberts as the most successful pirate of his generation involved a Brazilian treasure fleet that Spanish authorities had considered virtually invulnerable to attack. The convoy consisted of 42 vessels escorted by 2 heavily armed warships, a force that conventional military wisdom regarded as too powerful for pirate assault. Roberts' solution demonstrated the tactical innovation that made him legendary among both pirates and their opponents. Rather than attempting a direct attack against overwhelming odds, Roberts disguised his flagship as a Portuguese merchant vessel and sailed boldly into the middle of the convoy during daylight hours. His crew, hidden below decks until the crucial moment, emerged simultaneously to overwhelm the treasure ship's defenders before the escort vessels could respond effectively. The audacious maneuver captured wealth exceeding anything previously seized by Caribbean pirates, while demonstrating tactical brilliance that impressed even enemy commanders. The treasure captured in this single raid included gold and silver, worth over 2 million pieces of 8, an amount that would be valued in hundreds of millions in contemporary currency. More importantly, the psychological impact of the success reverberated throughout the Atlantic maritime community, establishing Roberts as a figure whose reputation transcended the usual boundaries between criminal and military achievement. But Roberts' success also attracted the concentrated attention of European naval forces that were becoming increasingly effective at hunting down pirate vessels. The same systematic approach that made his raids so profitable also created patterns that experienced naval commanders could analyze and exploit. The Royal Navy captain Challoner Ogle, assigned specifically to eliminate Roberts' threat to British shipping, studied the pirate captain's methods with professional thoroughness that gradually closed the net around his quarry. The final confrontation between Roberts and Ogle represented the collision between 2 different approaches to maritime warfare that symbolized the broader conflict between pirate independence and imperial authority. Roberts commanded crews whose loyalty was based on democratic participation and shared success, while Ogle led professional sailors whose effectiveness derived from rigid discipline and hierarchical command structures. The battle that sealed Roberts' fate occurred off the West African coast on February 10, 1722, when Ogle's HMS Swallow encountered the Royal Fortune at close range. Roberts, characteristically dressed in his finest crimson coat and gold jewellery, led his crew's resistance with the same courage that had made him legendary throughout the Atlantic world. But individual bravery could not overcome the systematic advantages that professional naval training provided to Ogle's crews. The grape shot that killed Roberts also marked the symbolic end of the Golden Age of Caribbean piracy. His death removed the most successful and charismatic leader of the pirate community at precisely the moment when European naval forces were achieving unprecedented effectiveness in suppressing maritime crime. The democratic traditions that had made pirate society unique could not survive the systematic elimination of the leaders who had created and maintained them. The crew members who survived Roberts' final battle faced choices that reflected the broader transformation occurring throughout the Caribbean as the pirate era drew to a close. Some accepted royal pardons and attempted to transition to legitimate occupations, while others continued criminal activities until they were captured or killed by increasingly effective law enforcement efforts. A few disappeared into the remote corners of the Caribbean world, where echoes of pirate traditions might survive for another generation. The legacy of Bartholomew Roberts extended far beyond his record of capturing over 400 vessels during his brief but spectacular career. His development of democratic leadership methods influenced subsequent maritime organizations, while his tactical innovations were studied by naval officers who recognized genius even in their enemies. Most importantly, his example demonstrated that individuals of humble origin could achieve greatness through merit and determination, rather than inherited advantages. But perhaps Roberts's most significant contribution to Caribbean history was his role in proving that alternative forms of social organization could function effectively even under the extreme pressures of constant warfare and legal persecution. The democratic principles that governed his crews, the racial equality that characterized his leadership style, and the economic arrangements that shared wealth according to contribution rather than birth-created communities that challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature and social possibility. As Roberts's story illustrates, the Golden Age of piracy represented more than mere criminal activity. It was a period of social experimentation that tested the limits of human cooperation and democratic governance under conditions that conventional society could barely imagine. The pirates who followed leaders like Roberts were not simply criminals seeking easy wealth, but participants in communities that offered freedoms and opportunities unavailable anywhere else in the 18th century world. The transformation of Caribbean society that followed the suppression of piracy created new forms of oppression that would prove far more systematic and enduring than anything the pirates had inflicted on their victims. The plantation system that replaced pirate communities was based on racial hierarchies and economic exploitation that violated every democratic principle that had flourished aboard pirate vessels. The irony was not lost on the former pirates, who found themselves living under conditions that were less free than those they had known during their criminal careers. Yet the memory of pirate democracy continued to influence Caribbean political development long after the last pirate flags had been hauled down. The independence movements that would eventually challenge European colonial authority drew inspiration from the egalitarian traditions that had briefly flourished in places like Nassau and Port Royal. The democratic ideals that pirates had developed aboard their ships provided models for later attempts to create just societies based on principles of equality and shared governance. The medical and technological innovations that emerged from pirate society also left lasting legacies that influenced subsequent Caribbean development. The surgical techniques developed by pirate physicians, the navigational methods perfected by pirate navigators, and the ship design improvements created by pirate carpenters were adopted by legitimate maritime industries that benefited from innovations born of criminal necessity. The linguistic and cultural influences of pirate society proved equally enduring. The Creole languages that developed in pirate communities, blending elements from European, African, and indigenous sources, provided foundations for the distinctive Caribbean dialects that would emerge during the plantation period. The musical traditions, storytelling methods, and artistic styles that flourished in pirate ports influenced cultural development throughout the region. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Golden Age of Piracy was its demonstration that ordinary people possess the capacity for self-governance and democratic participation that European political theory typically denied them. The sailors, slaves, and social outcasts who created pirate society proved that complex political and economic organizations could function effectively without the hierarchical structures that dominated conventional European thinking about governance and authority. The religious tolerance that characterized pirate communities also provided models for later attempts to create pluralistic societies in the Caribbean. The ability of pirate crews to accommodate practitioners of different faiths while maintaining social cohesion offered alternatives to the religious persecution that dominated European colonial policies. These examples of successful religious accommodation would influence later independence movements that sought to create nations capable of embracing diverse populations. As the 18th century progressed, and the last remnants of organized piracy disappeared from Caribbean waters, the region entered a new phase of development dominated by plantation agriculture and slave labor. The democratic traditions that had flourished during the pirate era were suppressed, but not entirely eliminated, surviving in folk traditions, oral histories, and the collective memory of communities that had experienced alternatives to European colonial authority. The transformation was neither complete nor irreversible. Throughout the plantation period, rebellions and resistance movements drew inspiration from the egalitarian ideals that had briefly flourished during the Golden Age of Piracy. Former pirates and their descendants played important roles in these resistance efforts, bringing with them knowledge of democratic organization and military tactics that proved valuable in challenging colonial authority. The economic principles that had governed pirate society also continued to influence Caribbean development in subtle but important ways. The tradition of sharing captured wealth according to contribution, rather than birth, provided models for later attempts to create more equitable economic arrangements. The commercial innovations that pirates had developed to dispose of stolen goods influenced legitimate trading practices that made Caribbean commerce more efficient and profitable. But the most enduring legacy of Caribbean piracy was its demonstration that human societies could organize themselves according to principles of equality and democratic participation even under the most challenging circumstances. The pirates who created these communities were not utopian dreamers, but practical individuals who understood that survival required cooperation and mutual support rather than hierarchical domination. Their achievement in creating functional democracies aboard ships and in port communities like Nassau proved that democratic governance was not dependent on particular cultural traditions or levels of education, but could emerge wherever people were free to organize themselves according to their own interests and values. This lesson would prove invaluable to later generations of Caribbean peoples who sought to create independent nations based on principles of equality and self-determination. The story of Caribbean piracy thus represents more than an exciting chapter in maritime history. It illustrates the human capacity for creating alternative forms of social organization that challenge the fundamental assumptions of European colonial society. The pirates who terrorized Spanish shipping lanes were also pioneers in democratic governance, whose experiments in equality and self-rule would influence political development throughout the Atlantic world. As we continue our journey through these historically rich waters, we approach the final transformation that would bring the Golden Age of Piracy to its definitive close. The same forces that had enabled pirate society to flourish were now turning against it with systematic efficiency that made resistance increasingly futile. Yet even in defeat, the pirates would leave behind legacies that would shape Caribbean society for generations to come. The dawn of the 1720s brought with it winds of change that would prove as destructive to pirate society as any hurricane that had ever swept across Caribbean waters. In the Admiralty offices of London, maps spread across polished tables showed red pins marking every known pirate stronghold from the Bahamas to the Venezuelan coast. The age of tolerating maritime criminals as useful irregulars was ending, replaced by a systematic campaign of extermination that would employ the full resources of the Royal Navy. Captain Woodes Rogers stood on the quarterdeck of his flagship as Nassau's familiar skyline emerged from the morning haze. Behind him sailed a flotilla of warships carrying enough firepower to reduce the pirate capital to splinters. But Rogers understood that military force alone would not solve the pirate problem. His commission as Royal Governor of the Bahamas included something far more dangerous to pirate society than cannons and marines: the authority to grant full pardons to any pirate willing to abandon their criminal career. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than forcing every pirate to fight to the death, Rogers offered them a choice between legitimate prosperity and inevitable destruction. The pardons came with conditions that reflected careful study of pirate psychology and social organization. Former pirates would receive land grants in the Bahamas, positions in the colonial militia, and opportunities for legitimate maritime employment. Most importantly, they would retain their personal freedom and democratic participation in colonial governance. The response to Rogers's arrival revealed the deep divisions that had been growing within pirate society as external pressures mounted and internal contradictions became impossible to ignore. Older pirates who had accumulated substantial wealth during successful careers saw the pardons as opportunities to retire with honor rather than face increasing risks of violent death or judicial execution. Younger pirates with fewer resources and less experience of conventional society viewed the offers as betrayal of the democratic principles that had made pirate communities attractive alternatives to European colonial hierarchy. The debates that raged in Nassau's taverns during the summer of 1718 exposed fundamental questions about the sustainability of criminal societies in an increasingly organized world. Charles Vane, perhaps the most uncompromising of the pirate captains, argued that accepting pardons would transform free men into subjects of the same colonial authorities they had spent years fighting. His followers, many of them recent recruits who had joined pirate crews to escape various forms of oppression, supported continued resistance even if it meant facing overwhelming odds. Benjamin Hornigold, the veteran pirate captain who had mentored both Blackbeard and Sam Bellamy before their rise to individual prominence, represented the pragmatic faction that recognized the changing realities of Caribbean politics. His analysis was coldly logical. The Royal Navy presence in Caribbean waters had increased tenfold since 1715, while the number of safe harbours available to pirates had correspondingly decreased. Continued resistance would result in the systematic elimination of pirate society through military action that no amount of individual courage could overcome. The division within Nassau's pirate community reflected broader changes occurring throughout the Caribbean, as European colonial authorities coordinated their anti-piracy efforts with unprecedented effectiveness, Spanish governors, who had once competed with their English and French counterparts, now shared intelligence about pirate movements and coordinated naval patrols that closed traditional escape routes. The international cooperation that emerged from mutual recognition that piracy threatened all colonial interests created a noose that was slowly tightening around the remaining pirate strongholds. Rogers's success in splitting the pirate community demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the social dynamics that held criminal organizations together. By offering legitimate alternatives that preserved the democratic participation and economic opportunities that had attracted men to piracy in the first place, he eliminated the grievances that had made criminal recruitment possible. Former pirates who accepted pardons became advocates for the colonial government among populations that had previously viewed official authority with suspicion and hostility. The transformation of Nassau from pirate republic to legitimate colonial settlement occurred with surprising speed once the pardons took effect. Hornigold and his followers, accepting Rogers' terms, formed the core of a colonial militia that proved devastatingly effective at hunting down pirates who refused to surrender. Their intimate knowledge of pirate tactics, hideouts, and psychology gave government forces advantages that conventional military units could never have possessed. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers that former pirates became the most effective agents of their own society's destruction. Men who had spent years evading capture by naval forces now used their skills to track down former comrades who had chosen continued resistance over legitimate retirement. The personal relationships that had once strengthened pirate solidarity now provided intelligence networks that made escape increasingly impossible. Charles Vane's attempt to maintain pirate resistance in the face of these overwhelming pressures illustrated both the courage and the futility that characterized the final phase of the Golden Age. His crew, reduced to a handful of die-hard followers, conducted desperate raids against increasingly well-defended targets while being pursued by forces that included former pirates now serving colonial authorities. The psychological pressure of fighting both official enemies and former allies proved as destructive as any military defeat. The capture and execution of Vane in 1720 marked a symbolic turning point in the war against piracy, but the systematic destruction of pirate society continued through less dramatic but equally effective means. The network of safe harbors that had once sheltered criminal fleets was systematically eliminated through military occupation and the establishment of permanent naval stations. Local populations that had previously provided supplies and information to pirates found themselves under constant surveillance by colonial authorities who possessed detailed knowledge of previous collaboration. The economic foundations of pirate society eroded as legitimate commerce replaced criminal enterprise throughout the Caribbean. The Spanish treasure fleets that had once provided irresistible targets for pirate attack were now escorted by heavily armed convoys that made successful raids prohibitively dangerous. More importantly, the growth of plantation agriculture created alternative sources of wealth that made colonial governments less dependent on the economic stimulus that pirate raids had previously provided. The demographic changes that accompanied the suppression of piracy transformed Caribbean society in ways that made the return of organized maritime crime virtually impossible. The plantation system required stable labor forces and predictable commercial relationships that were incompatible with the chaos that piracy had once brought to regional trade. Colonial populations that had once welcomed pirates as sources of cheap goods and economic opportunity now viewed them as threats to the prosperity that legitimate commerce had created. The technological advances that characterized early 18th century naval warfare also contributed to piracy's decline by eliminating many of the tactical advantages that had made pirate vessels effective against conventional opponents. Improved ship design, better navigation instruments, and more efficient communication systems gave naval forces capabilities that made it increasingly difficult for pirates to achieve the surprise attacks and rapid escapes that had been essential to their success. The legal innovations that accompanied the military campaign against piracy created new mechanisms for eliminating criminal enterprises that had previously operated beyond the reach of conventional justice. Admiralty courts, established throughout the Caribbean, possessed authority to try pirates according to streamlined procedures that eliminated many of the legal technicalities that had previously enabled criminals to escape punishment. The certainty of swift execution for captured pirates removed much of the romantic appeal that had attracted recruits to criminal careers. But perhaps the most significant factor in piracy's decline was the transformation of the social conditions that had made criminal recruitment possible in the first place. The democratic traditions that had flourished aboard pirate ships found new expression in colonial institutions that offered legitimate alternatives to criminal organization. Former pirates who accepted pardons discovered that they could participate in colonial governance while maintaining many of the freedoms that had made pirate society attractive. The integration of former pirates into legitimate colonial society created unexpected benefits that helped compensate for the economic losses that resulted from eliminating criminal enterprises. Their maritime skills proved valuable in developing legitimate shipping industries, while their knowledge of Caribbean waters enhanced colonial defense capabilities. Most importantly, their democratic traditions influenced colonial political development in ways that made Caribbean governance more responsive to popular concerns. The religious changes that accompanied the suppression of piracy reflected broader transformations in Caribbean colonial society, as plantation agriculture replaced maritime crime as the primary economic activity. The tolerant religious atmosphere that had characterized pirate communities gave way to more conventional arrangements where established churches received official support, while alternative spiritual practices faced increasing restrictions. Yet the tradition of religious accommodation that had flourished in pirate ports continued to influence colonial development in subtle but important ways. The cultural legacies of pirate society proved more enduring than their political and economic institutions. The musical traditions, storytelling methods, and artistic styles that had emerged from the mixing of different cultural influences in pirate communities continued to evolve within plantation society, creating distinctive Caribbean cultural forms that would influence regional development for generations. The linguistic innovations that had developed in pirate ports, blending elements from European, African, and indigenous sources, provided foundations for the Creole languages that would become central to Caribbean identity. The maritime traditions that had made piracy possible also found new expression in legitimate commercial activities that utilized the same skills and knowledge that had once served criminal enterprises. Former pirates established shipping companies, shipbuilding operations, and trading networks that contributed to the economic development of Caribbean colonial society. Their understanding of wind patterns, current flows, and seasonal weather variations proved invaluable in developing more efficient transportation systems that connected the Caribbean islands to Atlantic markets. The military innovations that had emerged from pirate warfare influenced colonial defense strategies that proved essential for protecting plantation societies against external threats. The tactical flexibility that had made pirate forces effective against conventional opponents was adapted for use by colonial militias that faced similar challenges in defending scattered settlements against various enemies. The democratic leadership methods that had characterized pirate crews found new application in military organizations that required high levels of motivation and initiative from individual soldiers. The medical knowledge that had developed within pirate communities, particularly expertise in treating tropical diseases and combat injuries, contributed to improvements in colonial healthcare that benefited entire populations. Former pirate physicians established practices that served plantation communities while training new generations of medical practitioners in techniques that had been developed through harsh experience in criminal environments. The surgical innovations that had emerged from the necessity of treating gunshot wounds and other violent injuries found application in civilian medical practice. The engineering and construction techniques that pirates had developed for building fortifications and harbour facilities were adapted for use in legitimate colonial projects that enhanced the infrastructure of Caribbean settlements. The democratic work organization methods that had characterized pirate construction projects influenced colonial building practices in ways that improved both efficiency and worker satisfaction. The innovative approaches to problem solving that had emerged from the necessity of maintaining vessels and equipment under difficult conditions found application in various civilian industries. But the most significant legacy of the Golden Age of Piracy was its demonstration that ordinary people possessed the capacity for creating complex social organizations based on principles of equality and democratic participation. The former pirates who integrated into colonial society brought with them experiences of self-governance that influenced political development throughout the Caribbean region. Their understanding of democratic leadership, economic cooperation, and social organization provided models for later movements seeking alternatives to European colonial hierarchy. The educational traditions that had emerged within pirate communities, particularly the emphasis on practical skills and merit-based advancement, continued to influence colonial society even after organized piracy had been eliminated. Former pirates established schools and training programs that provided opportunities for advancement based on ability rather than birth or social connections. The democratic values that had characterized pirate education found expression in colonial institutions that offered broader access to learning and skill development. The commercial innovations that pirates had developed for disposing of captured goods influenced legitimate trading practices throughout the Caribbean. The flexible market arrangements that had characterized pirate ports provided models for more efficient commercial organization that benefited both merchants and consumers. The international trading networks that had connected pirate communities to markets throughout the Atlantic world were adapted for legitimate use by colonial merchants seeking to expand their business opportunities. As the 1720s progressed and the systematic suppression of piracy continued, the remaining criminal enterprises found themselves increasingly isolated and desperate. The capture and execution of Bartholomew Roberts in 1722 eliminated the last great pirate captain whose reputation and organizational abilities had maintained significant criminal fleets. His death marked not just the end of individual criminal career, but the collapse of the social networks that had sustained organized piracy throughout the Caribbean. The final pirate crews that continued to operate after Roberts' death were reduced to small groups of desperate men whose activities resembled common banditry more than the sophisticated maritime enterprises that had characterized the Golden Age. Without safe harbors, legitimate sources of supply, or populations willing to provide support, these remnant pirates faced inevitable capture or death through the systematic patrol activities of increasingly effective naval forces. The transformation of Caribbean society that accompanied the end of organized piracy created new forms of social organization that incorporated some elements of pirate tradition while eliminating the criminal activities that had made such traditions possible. The plantation system that dominated Caribbean economics after 1730 was based on hierarchical social arrangements that violated many of the democratic principles that had flourished during the pirate era. But even this oppressive system was influenced by the precedents that criminal communities had established for racial integration and economic cooperation. The independence movements that would eventually challenge European colonial authority throughout the Caribbean drew inspiration from the democratic traditions that had briefly flourished during the Golden Age of Piracy. The memory of societies where ordinary people had governed themselves according to principles of equality and mutual respect provided powerful examples for later generations seeking alternatives to colonial oppression. The organizational methods that pirates had developed for coordinating collective action found new application in resistance movements that challenged plantation society and eventually achieved political independence. The environmental knowledge that pirate communities had accumulated through their intimate relationship with Caribbean waters and weather patterns continued to influence regional development long after organized piracy had ended. Former pirates established themselves as pilots, navigators, and maritime advisors whose understanding of local conditions proved invaluable for legitimate shipping operations. Their knowledge of hurricane patterns, current flows, and seasonal variations in wind and weather provided foundations for more sophisticated approaches to maritime transportation and coastal development. As our journey through the real history of Caribbean piracy draws toward its conclusion, we can see how the Golden Age represented both an ending and a beginning in the long story of human freedom and democratic aspiration. The pirates who terrorized Spanish shipping lanes were also pioneers in self-governance, whose experiments in equality and cooperation would influence political development throughout the Atlantic world. Their legacy reminds us that even in the darkest periods of human history, ordinary people possess the capacity for creating extraordinary alternatives to oppression and injustice. The gentle sound of Caribbean waves that carries you towards sleep tonight echoes with the voices of men and women who dare to imagine societies based on principles of equality and mutual respect. Their ships have long since rotted away. Their treasure has been spent or lost, and their names survive mainly in the stories that parents tell to children on quiet evenings. But the democratic ideals they fought and died for continue to inspire all who seek freedom from the various forms of tyranny that each generation must face and overcome. Sleep now and dream of blue waters where ordinary people once proved that extraordinary things become possible when human beings choose cooperation over domination, equality over hierarchy, and freedom over the false security of submission to unjust authority. The real pirates of the Caribbean were neither the villains of imperial propaganda nor the heroes of romantic fiction, but complex human beings whose struggles and achievements remind us that the fight for human dignity is as eternal as the sea itself. The warm Caribbean sun that once witnessed the final acts of piracy's golden age began to set on an era that had challenged every assumption about authority, freedom, and human possibility. By 1730, the last of the great pirate captains had been hunted down and eliminated, their crews scattered to the winds or absorbed into the legitimate maritime industries that were rapidly replacing criminal enterprises throughout the region. Yet, the transformation that followed their disappearance revealed truths about power and resistance that would echo through Caribbean history for generations to come. In the governor's mansion at Spanish Town, former pirates now served as colonial administrators. Their intimate knowledge of Caribbean waters and local populations, making them invaluable assets to the same imperial system they had once fought against. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers that men who had spent years evading royal authority now enforced it with ruthless efficiency. Their transformation from criminal to colonial official demonstrated the fluid nature of loyalty and legitimacy in a world where survival often required abandoning previous allegiances. The sugar plantations that spread across the Caribbean landscape like a green tide carried with them a form of oppression that made pirate brutality seem almost benevolent by comparison. Where pirates had created societies based on democratic participation and shared wealth, the plantation system established hierarchies of race and class that would endure for centuries. The enslaved Africans who labored in the cane fields under the tropical sun faced conditions that the most desperate pirate crew would have rejected as inhumane. Yet even within this system of systematic oppression, The democratic traditions that had flourished during the pirate era found new expression in the resistance networks that connected plantation communities throughout the Caribbean. Former pirates who had learned to organize collective action aboard their vessels shared their knowledge with enslaved populations seeking ways to challenge their master's authority. The organizational methods that had once coordinated pirate raids were adapted for planning slave rebellions that would periodically shake the foundations of colonial society. The maroon communities that established themselves in the mountainous interiors of islands like Jamaica drew heavily on the democratic traditions and military tactics that had characterized pirate society. These settlements of escaped slaves created governments based on principles of equality and collective decision-making that echoed the codes that had once governed pirate ships. Their leaders, many of whom had learned their organizational skills during brief careers as maritime criminals, established communities that successfully resisted colonial authority for generations. The transformation of Port Royal from the wickedest city on earth into a respectable colonial port illustrated the broader changes that were reshaping Caribbean society as the 18th century progressed. The rebuilt city that emerged from the ruins of the 1692 earthquake bore little resemblance to the democratic experiment that had once challenged European colonial conventions. Churches replaced brothels as centers of community life, while merchant houses conducted business according to imperial regulations, rather than the free market principles that had once made the port attractive to traders from across the Atlantic world. But beneath the veneer of colonial respectability, the memory of Port Royal's pirate heritage continued to influence the city's character in subtle but important ways. The taverns that served legitimate merchants maintained traditions of egalitarian socialization that had originated during the criminal era. The harbour workers who loaded and unloaded cargo ships retained organizational methods that reflected the democratic traditions of pirate crews. Most significantly, the multicultural population that had made Port Royal unique during its golden age continued to create new forms of cultural expression that blended influences from across the Atlantic world. The linguistic innovations that had emerged from the mixing of different cultural traditions in pirate communities provided foundations for the Creole languages that became central to Caribbean identity. The pidgin languages that had developed aboard pirate ships to facilitate communication between crew members speaking different native tongues evolved into sophisticated Creole systems that enabled complex cultural expression. These new languages carried with them grammatical structures and vocabulary that reflected the democratic values and egalitarian relationships that had characterized pirate society. The musical traditions that had flourished in pirate ports continued to evolve within plantation society, creating distinctive Caribbean musical forms that would eventually influence popular culture throughout the Atlantic world. The work songs that enslaved people sang in the cane fields incorporated rhythms and melodies that had originated in the taverns and brothels of Port Royal. The call and response patterns that had coordinated collective labor aboard pirate ships found new application in plantation work songs that helped enslaved communities maintain solidarity despite oppressive conditions. The storytelling traditions that had preserved pirate history and mythology within Caribbean folk culture provided models for resistance narratives that would inspire later independence movements. The tales of democratic pirates who had challenged imperial authority offered alternative visions of social organization that contradicted the hierarchical arrangements of plantation society. These stories, passed down through oral tradition from generation to generation, kept alive the memory of societies where ordinary people had governed themselves according to principles of equality and mutual respect. The religious syncretism that had characterized pirate communities found new expression in the spiritual practices that developed within plantation society. The tolerance for different religious traditions that had been necessary for maintaining harmony aboard multicultural pirate crews influenced the development of syncretic belief systems that combined elements from African, European, and indigenous spiritual traditions. These new religious forms provided enslaved populations with sources of strength and community that helped them resist the psychological destruction that plantation owners sought to impose. The medical knowledge that had been accumulated within pirate communities through harsh experience with tropical diseases and combat injuries continued to influence healthcare practices throughout the Caribbean. Former pirate physicians who established legitimate medical practices brought with them understanding of herbal remedies and surgical techniques that had been developed through necessity in criminal environments. Their knowledge, combined with medical traditions brought by enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples, created healing systems that were more effective than the conventional European medicine practiced in most colonial settlements. The engineering innovations that had emerged from the practical necessities of maintaining pirate vessels and fortifications found application in legitimate construction projects throughout the Caribbean. The democratic work organization methods that had characterized pirate building projects influenced colonial construction practices in ways that improved both efficiency and worker satisfaction. The problem-solving approaches that had been developed through the necessity of improvising solutions with limited resources proved valuable in colonial environments where European materials and techniques were often unavailable or impractical. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Golden Age of Piracy was its demonstration that alternative forms of social organization were not only possible, but could function effectively even under the most challenging circumstances. The democratic traditions that had flourished aboard pirate ships provided proof that ordinary people possessed the capacity for self-governance that European political theory typically denied them. This knowledge would prove invaluable to later generations of Caribbean peoples who sought to create independent nations based on principles of equality and democratic participation. The commercial innovations that pirates had developed for conducting trade outside the restrictions of European mercantile systems continued to influence Caribbean economic development long after organized piracy had been eliminated. The flexible market arrangements that had characterized pirate ports provided models for more efficient commercial organization that benefited both merchants and consumers. The international trading networks that had connected pirate communities to markets throughout the Atlantic world were adapted for legitimate use by colonial merchants seeking to expand their business opportunities beyond the limitations imposed by imperial trade policies. The navigation techniques that pirate crews had perfected through years of experience in Caribbean waters continued to influence maritime transportation throughout the region. Former pirates who established themselves as pilots and navigators brought with them knowledge of wind patterns, current flows, and seasonal weather variations that proved invaluable for legitimate shipping operations. Their understanding of hurricane behavior and tropical storm development provided foundations for more sophisticated approaches to maritime safety that reduced the risks faced by merchant vessels operating in Caribbean waters. The shipbuilding innovations that had emerged from the necessity of maintaining and modifying pirate vessels found application in legitimate maritime industries throughout the Caribbean. The democratic work organization methods that had characterized pirate shipyards influenced colonial shipbuilding practices in ways that improved both the quality of vessels produced and the working conditions of the craftsmen who built them. The design modifications that pirates had developed to improve vessel speed and maneuverability were incorporated into merchant ship construction, creating more efficient transportation systems that enhanced regional commerce. As the 18th century progressed and memories of the Golden Age of Piracy began to fade into legend, the Caribbean entered a new phase of development dominated by plantation agriculture and the systematic exploitation of enslaved labor. The democratic traditions that had briefly flourished during the pirate era were suppressed but not entirely eliminated, surviving in folk traditions, oral histories, and the collective memory of communities that had experienced alternatives to European colonial authority. The independence movements that would eventually challenge European colonial rule throughout the Caribbean drew inspiration from the egalitarian ideals that had characterized pirate society. The organizational methods that pirates had developed for coordinating collective action found new application in resistance movements that challenged plantation society and eventually achieved political independence. The democratic leadership techniques that had been perfected aboard pirate ships influenced revolutionary movements that sought to create nations based on principles of equality and self-determination. The environmental knowledge that pirate communities had accumulated through their intimate relationship with Caribbean ecosystems continued to influence regional development patterns long after organized piracy had ended. Former pirates who established themselves in legitimate occupations brought with them understanding of tropical agriculture, marine biology, and weather patterns that proved valuable for developing more sustainable approaches to economic development. Their knowledge of natural resources and ecological relationships provided foundations for more sophisticated resource management practices that enhanced the long-term viability of Caribbean communities. The educational traditions that had emerged within pirate communities, particularly the emphasis on practical skills and merit-based advancement, continued to influence social development throughout the Caribbean region. Former pirates who established schools and training programs provided opportunities for advancement based on ability rather than birth or social connections. The democratic values that had characterized pirate education found expression in colonial institutions that offered broader access to learning and skill development than was typically available in European societies. But the most enduring legacy of Caribbean piracy lay in its demonstration that human societies could organize themselves according to principles of justice and equality, even when operating outside the boundaries of conventional legal authority. The pirates who created democratic communities aboard their ships and in ports like Nassau proved that ordinary people possess the wisdom and capability necessary for self-governance when freed from the artificial constraints imposed by hierarchical social systems. Their achievement in creating functional democracies under the most challenging circumstances imaginable provided inspiration for all subsequent movements seeking alternatives to oppression and injustice. The knowledge that such alternatives were possible, that human beings could cooperate on terms of equality and mutual respect, would prove invaluable to later generations of Caribbean peoples who sought to throw off the chains of colonial domination and create societies based on principles of freedom and human dignity. The cultural innovations that had emerged from the mixing of different traditions within pirate communities continued to influence Caribbean artistic and intellectual development long after the criminal enterprises themselves had disappeared. The literary traditions that had preserved pirate stories and legends provided models for later Caribbean writers who sought to create distinctive regional literature that reflected local experiences and values. The artistic styles that had developed in pirate ports influenced visual arts throughout the region, creating distinctive Caribbean aesthetic traditions that would eventually gain international recognition. The technological innovations that had been developed within pirate communities to solve practical problems under resource-constrained conditions found application in legitimate industries throughout the Caribbean. The improvisational approaches that had characterized pirate engineering projects influenced colonial manufacturing and construction practices in ways that improved efficiency and reduced costs. The democratic work organization methods that had made pirate enterprises effective were adapted for use in legitimate businesses that sought to maximize both productivity and worker satisfaction. As the colonial period progressed, and the memory of the Golden Age of Piracy became increasingly romanticized in popular culture, the real lessons of that remarkable era began to be obscured by myths and legends that emphasized adventure and romance while downplaying the democratic innovations that had made pirate society truly revolutionary. The pirates who had once challenged the fundamental assumptions of European colonial society were transformed into cartoon characters whose exploits entertained children while teaching them nothing about the possibilities for human freedom and cooperation that their ancestors had briefly realized. Yet beneath the surface of colonial society, the democratic traditions that had flourished during the pirate era continued to influence political developments in ways that would eventually transform the entire Caribbean region. The memory of societies where ordinary people had governed themselves according to principles of equality and mutual respect provided powerful examples for later generations seeking alternatives to colonial oppression. The organizational methods that pirates had developed for coordinating collective action found new application in resistance movements that would eventually achieve the political independence that the pirates themselves had briefly enjoyed. The economic principles that had governed pirate society also continued to influence Caribbean development in subtle but important ways. The tradition of sharing captured wealth according to contribution rather than birth provided models for later attempts to create more equitable economic arrangements. The commercial innovations that pirates had developed to operate outside the restrictions of European mercantile systems influenced legitimate trading practices that made Caribbean commerce more efficient and profitable while providing greater benefits to local populations. The religious tolerance that had characterized pirate communities provided models for later attempts to create pluralistic societies capable of accommodating diverse populations with different cultural and spiritual traditions. The ability of pirate crews to maintain social cohesion despite religious and cultural differences offered alternatives to the sectarian conflicts that plagued European societies and their colonial extensions. These examples of successful religious accommodation would influence later independence movements that sought to create nations capable of embracing diversity while maintaining unity. The military innovations that had emerged from pirate warfare continued to influence Caribbean defense strategies long after organized piracy had been eliminated. The guerrilla tactics that had made pirate forces effective against conventional opponents were adapted for use by colonial militias and later by independence movements that faced similar challenges in confronting superior enemy forces. The democratic leadership methods that had characterized pirate military organization influenced revolutionary armies that required high levels of motivation and initiative from individual soldiers. But perhaps the most significant contribution that the Golden Age of Piracy made to Caribbean history was its proof that human beings possessed an innate capacity for creating just societies based on principles of equality and cooperation. The pirates who briefly established democratic communities throughout the Caribbean demonstrated that such societies were not utopian dreams, but practical possibilities that could be realized whenever people were free to organize themselves according to their own values and interests. This knowledge would prove invaluable to subsequent generations of Caribbean peoples who faced the challenge of creating independent nations after centuries of colonial oppression. The memory of pirate democracy provided evidence that self-governance was not a privilege reserved for particular races or cultures, but a universal human capacity that could flourish whenever artificial barriers to equality were removed. The organizational methods that pirates had developed for managing diverse communities would influence the political institutions created by newly independent Caribbean nations seeking to accommodate populations with different ethnic, cultural, and religious backgrounds. As we reach the end of our journey through the real history of Caribbean piracy, we can see how this remarkable era represented both a culmination and a beginning in the long struggle for human freedom and dignity. The pirates who terrorized Spanish shipping lanes were also pioneers in democratic governance, whose experiments in equality and cooperation would influence political development throughout the Atlantic world and beyond. Their legacy reminds us that even in the darkest periods of human history, when oppression seems overwhelming and alternatives appear impossible, ordinary people possess the courage and wisdom necessary to create extraordinary alternatives to injustice. The democratic ideals that flourished aboard pirate ships and in communities like Nassau continue to inspire all who seek freedom from the various forms of tyranny that each generation must confront and overcome. The transformation of the Caribbean from a region dominated by pirate democracy to one controlled by plantation hierarchy and then to modern independent nations reflects the ongoing human struggle between the forces of equality and oppression, cooperation and domination, freedom and control. The pirates who briefly created alternatives to European colonial authority demonstrated that such struggles can be won, that human societies can be organized according to principles of justice and mutual respect, when people possess the courage to reject artificial limitations on human possibility. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep on the gentle rhythm of Caribbean waves, remember that these same waters once carried vessels whose crews had proven that democracy was not a distant ideal, but a practical reality that ordinary people could create and maintain even under the most challenging circumstances. Their ships have long since returned to the sea that gave them birth, but the knowledge they gained and the examples they set continue to illuminate the path towards societies based on human dignity and mutual respect. The real pirates of the Caribbean were neither the villains of imperial propaganda nor the romantic heroes of popular entertainment, but complex human beings whose brief moment in history revealed possibilities for social organization that challenged every assumption about authority, hierarchy, and human nature itself. Their story reminds us that the fight for freedom is as eternal as the tides, and that each generation must rediscover for itself the courage and wisdom necessary to create the just societies that remain humanity's highest aspiration. Sleep now, and let the eternal rhythm of the sea carry you toward dreams of blue waters where ordinary people once proved that extraordinary things become possible when human beings choose to organize their societies according to principles of equality, cooperation, and mutual respect. The legacy of their brief but brilliant experiment in human freedom continues to inspire all who believe that a better world is not only possible but inevitable if we possess the courage to learn from their example and the determination to continue their unfinished work. The gentle Caribbean breeze that once carried the acrid smoke of burning ships and the dying screams of desperate men now whispers across waters that have forgotten the taste of blood. As the 18th century drew toward its close, the last echoes of cannon fire faded into memory, replaced by the rhythmic crack of whips in sugar fields and the mournful songs of enslaved peoples, whose chains had replaced the democratic bonds that once united pirate crews in brotherhood. The transformation was so complete, so systematic in its erasure of what had come before, that within a generation, children born in Caribbean ports would grow to adulthood, never knowing that their harbours had once sheltered vessels where former slaves commanded white sailors, where decisions were made by democratic vote rather than aristocratic decree, where a man's worth was measured by his courage and competence rather than the colour of his skin or the circumstances of his birth. Yet, in the remote corners of the Caribbean world, in the mountainous interiors of Jamaica and the hidden valleys of Hispaniola, communities of Maroons maintained traditions that echoed the democratic principles that had once flourished aboard pirate ships. These settlements of escaped slaves, many led by men who had learned organizational skills during brief careers as maritime criminals, created governments based on collective decision-making and shared responsibility that preserved the egalitarian ideals of the Golden Age. The Windward Maroons of Jamaica, established in the Blue Mountains under leaders like Cudjoe and Nanny, developed military and political structures that reflected the democratic traditions of pirate society. Their towns operated according to principles of equality and mutual aid that would have been familiar to any veteran of Bartholomew Roberts's crew. When British colonial forces attempted to suppress these communities, they faced opponents who employed the same guerrilla tactics and psychological warfare that had once made pirate vessels so effective against conventional naval forces. The peace treaties that eventually ended the Maroon Wars represented a form of recognition that echoed the grudging respect that European powers had once accorded to successful pirate captains. The colonial government acknowledged Maroon autonomy within designated territories while securing promises that the communities would not harbour new refugees from plantation slavery. These agreements, like the pardons that had once ended pirate careers, demonstrated that even the most hierarchical societies could be forced to negotiate with those who possessed sufficient organisation and determination to defend their freedom. But the most significant legacy of the Golden Age of Piracy lay not in these isolated communities of resistance, but in the cultural memories and organisational knowledge that former pirates carried into the legitimate institutions of Caribbean colonial society. The democratic traditions that had governed pirate ships found new expression in the religious congregations, trade associations, and community organisations that provided structure for colonial life beyond the direct control of imperial authorities. The Baptist and Methodist churches that gained popularity among Caribbean populations during the late 18th century offered forms of religious participation that reflected the egalitarian principles that had characterized pirate society. These denominations emphasize personal religious experience over clerical authority, democratic governance over hierarchical control, and spiritual equality that transcended racial and social boundaries. Former pirates who joined these congregations brought with them understanding of democratic leadership and collective decision-making that influenced the development of Caribbean Christianity in ways that would prove crucial for later independence movements. The craft guilds and trading associations that emerged in Caribbean ports during the transition from piracy to legitimate commerce reflected organizational methods that had been perfected aboard criminal vessels. These groups operated according to principles of mutual aid and collective governance that preserved many of the democratic traditions that had made pirate society unique. Their members, many of whom were former pirates or their descendants, maintained networks of cooperation and support that provided alternatives to the hierarchical structures imposed by colonial authorities. The educational traditions that had emerged within pirate communities continued to influence Caribbean intellectual development long after organized crime had been eliminated. The emphasis on practical skills and merit-based advancement that had characterized pirate training found new expression in the schools and apprenticeship programs established by former pirates who had transitioned to legitimate occupations. These institutions provided opportunities for advancement based on ability rather than birth or social connections, creating pathways for social mobility that challenged the rigid hierarchies of plantation society. The linguistic innovations that had developed within multicultural pirate crews continued to evolve within Caribbean colonial society, creating the distinctive Creole languages that would become central to regional identity. These new languages carried with them grammatical structures and vocabulary that reflected the democratic values and egalitarian relationships that had characterized pirate society. The call and response patterns that had coordinated collective labor aboard pirate ships found new application in work songs, religious ceremonies, and community gatherings that maintained traditions of participatory communication despite the authoritarian atmosphere of plantation society. The musical traditions that had flourished in pirate ports provided foundations for the distinctive Caribbean musical forms that would eventually influence popular culture throughout the Atlantic world. The rhythmic complexity that had emerged from the mixing of African, European, and indigenous musical traditions in places like Port Royal continued to evolve within plantation communities, creating new forms of artistic expression that preserved memories of more egalitarian social arrangements while providing emotional sustenance for populations living under oppressive conditions. The storytelling traditions that had preserved pirate history and mythology within Caribbean folk culture became vehicles for transmitting alternative visions of social organization that contradicted the hierarchical arrangements of plantation society. Tales of democratic pirates who had challenged imperial authority offered models for resistance that would inspire later independence movements. These stories, passed down through oral tradition from generation to generation, kept alive the memory of societies where ordinary people had governed themselves according to principles of equality and mutual respect. But perhaps the most profound transformation that accompanied the end of the Golden Age of Piracy was the gradual erosion of the racial egalitarianism that had characterized criminal communities. The plantation system that replaced pirate enterprises was based on racial hierarchies that violated every democratic principle that had flourished aboard pirate vessels. Where pirate crews had demonstrated that racial differences were irrelevant to individual capability and worth, plantation society created legal and social structures that defined human value according to skin color and ancestry. The irony was devastating in its completeness. The same Caribbean waters that had once carried vessels where former slaves commanded integrated crews now transported ships laden with human cargo, destined for lives of perpetual bondage. The ports that had once welcomed pirates, regardless of their racial or national origins, became markets where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. The democratic traditions that had briefly transformed Caribbean society into a laboratory for human equality were systematically destroyed and replaced with arrangements that reduced millions of people to the status of property. Yet even within this system of systematic dehumanization, the memory of pirate egalitarianism continued to influence resistance movements that challenged the foundations of plantation society. The organizational methods that pirates had developed for coordinating collective action found new application in slave rebellions that periodically shook the Caribbean world. The democratic leadership techniques that had been perfected aboard pirate ships influenced revolutionary movements that sought to restore the principles of equality and self-determination that had once flourished in criminal communities. The Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 and culminated in the establishment of the world's first successful slave republic, drew heavily on the organizational traditions and egalitarian ideals that had characterized Caribbean piracy. The leaders of this extraordinary uprising, many of whom had learned about democratic governance through oral traditions that preserved memories of the Golden Age, created political institutions that reflected the participatory principles that had once governed pirate society. Toussaint Louverture, the brilliant military and political leader who transformed a slave rebellion into a successful independence movement, employed tactical innovations that echoed the guerrilla methods that had made pirate forces so effective against conventional opponents. His understanding of psychological warfare, his ability to forge alliances across racial and class boundaries, and his commitment to democratic principles reflected the influence of pirate traditions that had survived within Caribbean folk culture despite systematic attempts at suppression. The Constitution that the independent Republic of Haiti adopted in 1805 included provisions that directly contradicted the racial hierarchies of plantation society while reflecting the egalitarian principles that had characterized pirate communities. The document declared that all citizens, regardless of their skin color, would be considered black in the eyes of the law, effectively eliminating racial distinctions that had been used to justify slavery and oppression. This revolutionary approach to racial equality echoed the colorblind meritocracy that had governed pirate ships, where a man's worth was measured by his actions rather than his ancestry. The economic arrangements that emerged in independent Haiti also reflected the influence of pirate traditions that emphasized shared prosperity rather than individual accumulation. The revolutionary government's attempts to redistribute plantation lands among former slaves echoed the democratic economic principles that had governed the distribution of captured wealth aboard pirate vessels. These policies, while often imperfectly implemented, demonstrated continuing commitment to the egalitarian ideals that had briefly flourished during the Golden Age of Piracy. But the international response to Haiti's successful revolution revealed the extent to which the democratic traditions of pirate society threatened the fundamental assumptions of Atlantic world civilization. European powers and the United States, horrified by the prospect of a successful Black Republic that proved the possibility of racial equality, imposed diplomatic and economic isolation that crippled the new nation's development. The same colonial authorities who had once grudgingly negotiated with pirate captains refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of a government that had achieved independence through the application of democratic principles that pirates had pioneered. The isolation of Haiti demonstrated that the egalitarian ideals of pirate society remained as threatening to established authority in the 19th century as they had been during the Golden Age itself. The knowledge that ordinary people could organize themselves according to principles of equality and self-determination continued to challenge hierarchical systems that depended on popular acceptance of artificial distinctions based on race, class, and national origin. Throughout the 19th century, independence movements across the Caribbean drew inspiration from both the Haitian example and the deeper traditions of democratic resistance that traced back to the Golden Age of Piracy. The organizational methods that had been developed aboard pirate ships found new application in revolutionary movements that sought to throw off the chains of colonial domination and create societies based on principles of freedom and human dignity. José Martí, the brilliant Cuban revolutionary who led the struggle for independence from Spanish rule, explicitly acknowledged the influence of Caribbean democratic traditions that had originated during the pirate era. His vision of a Cuban republic based on racial equality and social justice reflected the egalitarian principles that had briefly flourished in communities like Nassau and Port Royal. The organizational methods he developed for coordinating revolutionary activities across class and racial boundaries echoed the participatory techniques that had made pirate enterprises so effective. The labor movements that emerged throughout the Caribbean during the late 19th and early 20th centuries also drew heavily on the democratic traditions that had originated in pirate society. The strikes and protests that challenged plantation owners and colonial authorities employed organizational methods that reflected the collective decision-making processes that had governed pirate crews. The solidarity that united workers across racial and national boundaries echoed the egalitarian principles that had made pirate communities unique in their historical context. Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican activist who founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association and inspired millions of people of African descent throughout the Atlantic world, explicitly invoked the memory of Caribbean democratic traditions in his calls for Black liberation and self-determination. His vision of African redemption and racial pride drew on folk memories of the Golden Age when Black and white pirates had fought side by side as equals aboard vessels that recognized no authority beyond their own democratic decisions. The Pan-African movements that emerged during the 20th century continued to draw inspiration from the egalitarian traditions that had originated in Caribbean pirate society. The knowledge that racial equality was not only possible, but had actually been achieved in historical communities provided powerful evidence against racist ideologies that sought to justify continued oppression. The organizational methods that had been developed for governing multicultural pirate crews influenced the international networks that connected liberation movements across the African diaspora. The independence movements that swept through the Caribbean during the mid-20th century represented the culmination of centuries of struggle that trace back to the democratic traditions of the Golden Age of Piracy. The political institutions created by newly independent nations reflected the influence of participatory principles that had been preserved within folk culture despite systematic attempts at suppression by colonial authorities. The Caribbean Federation that briefly united several English-speaking islands during the late 1950s embodied many of the cooperative principles that had characterized pirate confederations, like the one that had operated from Nassau during the early 18th century. The democratic governance structures that member nations developed reflected the influence of egalitarian traditions that had been maintained within Caribbean political culture despite centuries of colonial rule. The cultural renaissance that accompanied Caribbean independence also drew heavily on artistic and intellectual traditions that had originated during the Golden Age of Piracy. The literature, music, and visual arts that emerged from newly independent nations celebrated the democratic values and multicultural cooperation that had briefly flourished in pirate communities while providing inspiration for continued struggles against various forms of oppression and injustice. Bob Marley, the Jamaican musician whose reggae songs inspired liberation movements throughout the world, explicitly invoked the memory of Caribbean democratic traditions in his calls for unity and resistance to oppression. His vision of universal brotherhood and his rejection of artificial divisions based on race, class, and nationality reflected the egalitarian principles that had governed pirate society, while demonstrating their continued relevance for contemporary struggles for human dignity and freedom. The Rastafarian movement that emerged in Jamaica during the 20th century also drew on folk memories of the Golden Age of Piracy in developing its critique of colonial society and its vision of African redemption. The movement's emphasis on equality, its rejection of hierarchical religious authority, and its celebration of resistance to oppression reflected the influence of democratic traditions that had been preserved within Caribbean culture despite systematic attempts at suppression. As the 20th century progressed and Caribbean nations achieved political independence, the challenge became how to translate the democratic ideals that had been preserved within folk culture into effective governmental institutions capable of addressing contemporary challenges. The experience of pirate democracy provided valuable lessons about the possibilities and limitations of participatory governance under difficult circumstances. The economic development strategies that independent Caribbean nations pursued also reflected the influence of traditions that had originated during the Golden Age of Piracy. The emphasis on regional cooperation, the commitment to reducing inequality, and the rejection of exploitative relationships with former colonial powers echoed the egalitarian principles that had governed pirate economic arrangements. These approaches, while often imperfectly implemented, demonstrated continuing commitment to the democratic values that had briefly flourished during the criminal era. The environmental movements that emerged throughout the Caribbean during the late 20th century drew on the intimate knowledge of natural systems that had been accumulated by pirate communities through their close relationship with marine ecosystems. The understanding of sustainable resource use that had been developed through harsh experience in criminal environments provided foundations for more sophisticated approaches to environmental protection that recognize the interconnections between social justice and ecological health. The tourism industries that became central to Caribbean economies during the late 20th century created complex relationships with the pirate heritage that had once made the region infamous throughout the Atlantic world. The romanticized versions of pirate history that attracted visitors often obscured the democratic innovations that had made pirate society genuinely revolutionary, while perpetuating stereotypes that reduced complex historical figures to cartoon characters. Yet even these simplified representations of pirate history maintained awareness of alternatives to conventional social arrangements that continued to inspire those seeking change. The knowledge that ordinary people had once created societies based on principles of equality and cooperation, however distorted by popular entertainment, provided evidence that such alternatives remained possible for contemporary generations, willing to learn from historical examples. The technological innovations that transformed Caribbean society during the late 20th and early 21st centuries created new opportunities for implementing the democratic principles that had originated during the Golden Age of Piracy. Communication technologies that enabled instant coordination across vast distances made possible forms of participatory governance that echoed the collective decision-making processes that had governed pirate crews, while overcoming the geographical limitations that had once constrained democratic participation. The Internet and social media platforms that connected Caribbean communities throughout the diaspora created virtual spaces where the egalitarian traditions of pirate society could find new expression. Online forums and digital networks that operated according to principles of equality and mutual respect demonstrated that the democratic ideals that had briefly flourished during the criminal era remained relevant for contemporary efforts to create more just and participatory forms of social organization. The globalization processes that integrated Caribbean economies into worldwide networks during the late 20th century created both opportunities and challenges that echoed the experiences of pirate communities that had operated outside the boundaries of conventional authority. The need to balance local autonomy with international cooperation reflected dilemmas that pirate confederations had faced when trying to coordinate collective action while maintaining individual freedom. The climate change challenges that confronted Caribbean nations during the early 21st century required forms of regional cooperation that drew on the collaborative traditions that had originated during the Golden Age of Piracy. The small island states that faced existential threats from rising sea levels and increasingly violent storms needed to develop new forms of solidarity that transcended national boundaries while preserving local autonomy. The organizational methods that had once enabled pirate confederations to coordinate collective action provided models for contemporary efforts to address shared challenges through democratic cooperation. As we reach the final moments of our journey through the real history of Caribbean piracy, we can see how this remarkable era established patterns of resistance and cooperation that continue to influence Caribbean society today. The democratic traditions that flourished aboard pirate ships and in communities like Nassau provided proof that ordinary people possessed the capacity for creating just societies based on principles of equality and mutual respect. The legacy of the Golden Age extends far beyond the romantic adventures that popular culture celebrates to encompass fundamental insights about human nature and social possibility that remain relevant for contemporary struggles against various forms of oppression and injustice. The pirates who briefly created alternatives to European colonial authority demonstrated that such alternatives were not utopian dreams, but practical possibilities that could be realized whenever people possessed the courage to reject artificial limitations on human potential. The transformation of the Caribbean from a region dominated by pirate democracy to one controlled by plantation hierarchy, and then to modern independent nations, reflects the ongoing human struggle between the forces of equality and oppression, cooperation and domination, freedom and control. The pirates who challenged European colonial authority proved that such struggles could be won, that human societies could be organized according to principles of justice and dignity when people possess the determination to create better alternatives. Tonight, as the eternal rhythm of Caribbean waves carries you towards sleep, remember that these same waters once supported communities where former slaves commanded ships, where decisions were made by democratic vote rather than aristocratic decree, where a person's worth was measured by their character and competence rather than the circumstances of their birth. Their vessels have long since returned to the sea that gave them life, but the knowledge they gained and the examples they set continue to illuminate pathways towards societies based on human dignity and mutual respect. The real pirates of the Caribbean were neither the villains of imperial propaganda nor the romantic heroes of popular entertainment, but complex human beings whose brief experiment in democratic governance revealed possibilities for social organization that challenged every assumption about authority, hierarchy, and human nature itself. Their story reminds us that the struggle for freedom is as eternal as the tides, and that each generation must rediscover for itself the courage and wisdom necessary to create the just societies that remain humanity's highest aspiration. Sleep peacefully now, and let the gentle sound of waves against distant shores carry you toward dreams where ordinary people once proved that extraordinary transformations become possible when human beings choose to organize their communities according to principles of equality, cooperation, and shared prosperity. The democratic ideals that briefly flourished in these tropical waters continue to inspire all who believe that a better world is not only possible, but inevitable. If we possess the courage to learn from their example and the determination to continue their unfinished work toward a future where freedom and justice are not distant dreams, but living realities that every person can experience and enjoy,